let's learn how to model. We're gonna learn how to create a Ghostbusters trap together.
Well, that wasn't such a chore now, was it?
Here's some student examples of what we're gonna make. Welcome to Maya for Beginners, the modeling section. This is a free course I'm giving to you on YouTube, and I'll leave it up for as long as people are watching it, but I might take it down, so go ahead and watch it while you can. This is part of a larger course called Maya for Beginners, where literally tens of thousands of people have taken this paid course, and I'm giving you this section for free. And I've even had a professor steal this course and teach it as a university, and I've had feedback from other people tell me that this course has helped them pass their college level exams and projects. So if you want to take the entire thing after watching this free section, then check out the whole course at the link below, which you can enroll in. So this is just part of the modeling course, and Maya for Beginners covers every kind of section. So we have modeling, texturing, rigging, animation, and some dynamic effects as well. So this is the animation we make together from start to finish in the course. So again, if you want to take the entire course, click the link in the description. But let's get started now with this free section so we can learn 3D modeling together using Autodesk Maya. Each lesson is divided up into chapters you can click below. Let's get started. Welcome to this first lesson in Maya, where we're going to cover the interface. It's the first thing you see when you open Maya, so it's good to get familiarized with it. And as you go through this course, you'll become more and more familiar with it and comfortable using it, but it's a great place to start just so that we know what we're looking at, because it's easy to get intimidated when you're first starting to learn 3D. I know I was when I opened up a program and you see all of these buttons and all of these menus and you have no idea what's important and what's not. And it just looks like some crazy alien interface, and where do you even begin with that? So that's why I have this lesson. You can refer back to it, but it's also just kind of to ease your fears, right? Like, you're not going to need to learn every single little button and menu option here to be successful in Maya and use it. I'm going to show you the things that we use the most, and in this interface, I'm going to show you kind of how to visually categorize these things so you can kind of know, okay, I'm probably not going to use this, so visually I don't need to worry about kind of that chaos of all these buttons up here. So let's just kind of take an overall look at this. Normally when you open up Maya, you're going to get some type of a view like this. And you can see down here that it says PERSP. And that tells us the camera view that we're viewing in the viewport. And that's what this middle section is here. This is called the viewport. And you can see the axes down here on the lower left. So you can see Y is up and Z is kind of to the left. And so this is where we're going to see everything that's happening in our scene. And down here we have a timeline for when we start animating. We can scrub this, we can play it over here, we can set it to loop back several times by clicking that. We can turn on auto key, turn that off, change the frame range, all of these things. But typically when I'm using this, I use it just like this. I scrub, I look, and then I can change frame range, clicking and dragging that, or typing in numbers here. And these two numbers actually just mean the kind of in and out points of what we're looking at versus the whole scene, right? So you can see we can kind of adjust this and slide this around, but it doesn't change the first number. And that's why that's kind of the absolute values of the in and out of the scene. But we can temporarily change that kind of scale so we can see, you know, a smaller scale of the timeline. So it's easier to scrub a smaller section if it's a very big shot or something like that. And if you double click it, it will jump out to the whole thing and maximize to the entire length of the frame range that you've set. So that's the bottom part. And you can see down here in the bottom left, this will be very helpful as you're starting. This will display short help tips and tools and selections. So if I'm going up here and I don't know what this is and I hover over it, I'll get a tooltip that will pop up. But if you're looking in the lower left as well, it'll say the same thing. So if you're a little impatient for the tooltip to pop up, you can just look in the lower left and you can see as I scrub my mouse through, I'm not clicking anything, I'm just hovering over everything. You can see it's showing me what each one of these tools is named and what they do. And if you leave it over there, you know, the tooltip will also pop up. So that's one quick way to figure out what all these little things do up here. Don't worry about what each one of them does yet. We'll get into that later, but just to know, you know, these are different tabs for different kind of sections. And these sections are also kind of related to these different drop-down menus here. Maya tries to organize the menus into different disciplines. So you can see modeling, rigging, animation. It's all separated into their own menu sets because typically if you're doing one, you're not really going to be doing the other. And in a production, normally this is kind of the linear workflow of how things are made anyways. First you model something, then you rig it, then you animate it. For example, you can't really animate something that doesn't exist, so you have to model it first. And if you're going to rig it, then you need to rig it before animation. So it's just kind of, they try to do it in a way, an order that makes sense for how you're going to create things and animate things and render things. That's why these are ordered the way they are. And you can see that they change the menu options up here, but only after Windows. You can see, watch Windows, and as I change the options, Windows stays the same. So everything from File to Windows is never going to change, and everything after that will. And a lot of these things, so I'm in the animation tab here in the drop-down menu, and I'm on the animation shelf here, and you can see there's Play Blast, there's different kind of options, and a lot of those things are also here. So you can see Play Blast is here as well. It's the same icon, it's the same tooltip. So even though there's all these different buttons, they actually just put them in more than one place. So it makes it look more complicated than it is because the same option is put in several different places. So for example, with Play Blast, I could actually even right click on the timeline down here and it's off the screen. But if you do this on in your Maya, you can go down to the bottom and you can see an option for Play Blast again. So Play Blast, for example, is in 3 different places. So you know, this is also another reason why not to get overwhelmed by all these options, because visually it looks like there's a ton of them, but really they're just the same ones over and over in different ways. You know, depending on how you want to work or select options or menus or how you want to select tools, then they try to give you as many options as you want to really, which is a little too much. Typically, you're only ever going to, you know, use this up here or the shelf. It's whatever you're comfortable with. I find it kind of hard to remember what each one of these icons are, and then to wait for the, you know, tooltip to pop up. Typically I'm going through the menu up here and I'm not using this as much, but it's definitely nice to have sometimes on a couple different things. Like, you know, in this course, I'm probably going to make, you know, a couple spheres just to show you how things work. We'll get into manipulating things in the next lesson. But, you know, besides that, I don't really use the shelf options all that much. So now that we have this kind of shelf option and some of these menu things covered, let's look at what's in between them. We kind of see this, you know, drop-down menu that we talked about, but then there's all these buttons up here, and they all do different types of things that we're going to get into a lot later. So for right now, just know that you don't really have to worry about any of these things, and we'll slowly cover these later. These aren't super important in getting started, so we're just going to skip them now for the interface. Don't worry about these. So the next kind of thing we want to look at are these different windows as well. So we have, you know, a blank window here, we have blank window here, they have their own little tabs here, and then there's these tabs on the side. So again, it seems like there's a ton of options, but it's really not. So for example, with this tab, this can actually be, you know, closed down by clicking it or double clicking it to open it back up. But if you noticed here, this little button gets highlighted and unhighlighted as we're clicking it. So it's the same thing like we were talking about earlier with the Play Blast. It's just a different way to select kind of menu options here. So you can do it from up here, or you can do it from this tab. So you can see the modeling toolkit, we can go back to the attributes, or we could select over here. So why this is significant is because if I create a sphere, this is going to tell me the name. It's going to tell me where it is in space. Is it on? Is it visible? And the history of the object and any inputs there are. So I can see what the inputs are. So this is kind of a quick way to see what's the status of this object, where it is. If I go to the attribute editor, I can kind of see this information displayed a little bit differently. So I can see, you know, translate is all 0. If we go back to the channel box, we can see that's shown here as well. It's just the same thing shown twice, like we were talking about earlier. So I want to help simplify this stuff in your mind so you don't feel like that, you know, this is something different than this. It's not. It's the same thing. It's just in a different place. So just to kind of emphasize this again, I I wanted to show you something that I use quite a bit. If you hold down spacebar, you will get the hotbox menu, what Maya calls the hotbox menu. And I'm holding down spacebar and I have all of the menu options available to me. You might be able to tell that it's ordered the same exact way that the tabs over here are ordered. So modeling, you can see mesh, mesh, edit mesh, mesh tools, and so on and so on. You can see rigging, animation, effects, and rendering. And that's the exact same way this is laid out over here. So it's just a quicker way to get to all of these menus is by holding down spacebar. And I use that quite a bit. It took me a couple years to get used to it and actually use it because I think it does take a little familiarity with Maya to feel comfortable with this. But the sooner you use this, the quicker you'll be in Maya. And I would highly encourage you to use this instead of having to hunt around for stuff up here and changing menus. You can get to everything right here by holding down spacebar. So that's a pretty useful tip that I think will be useful even more later. Now that we know what the channel box is and the difference with the attribute editor, let's jump over to this section. We can see the viewport has its own options. And if you hover over each one of these objects, you'll also get the tooltip. And so I won't go over each one of these because, to be honest, they're not very helpful as a beginner starting out. These aren't really that important. But I did want to talk about the different views in Maya. So if I don't hold down spacebar and I just tap it, you can see I get multiple views. And typically what you'll see, just click this over here, is something like this when you're just starting out in Maya. So if I hit spacebar again with my mouse just hovering over a different window, I'm not clicking anything with my mouse, I can jump into those views. And you can see what the views are by the camera name: top Y, front Z, side X, perspective. And so we can jump between different perspective views. If we need to see something top down and modeling, we can do that. So that's one quick way to divide up the screen as well. So if we wanted to divide up the screen in a different way, we can go to panels, layouts, and we can say 2 panes side by side. And that's what I had earlier that you saw, because this is the way I like to animate sometimes. So I can get back to the perspective view just by hitting spacebar. And these kind of buttons over here are just kind of like shortcuts to these different modes as well. Instead of hitting spacebar, you can kind of jump through. And one of the last things I want to talk about is the outliner. And the outliner you're going to have open and spend a lot of time in because it's basically a table of contents of what's in your scene. You can see that we have these different cameras that we saw earlier when we were in the kind of 4-view setup. And they're all gray because they're hidden. We can't actually see them in the interface. So we can see the P-Sphere 1. And that's one way that we can select this object, or we can select it just by clicking it, left mouse clicking. So that's kind of 2 ways to select things, either through the outliner or through the viewport. So that is a quick rundown on the interface. I hope it got you a little more familiarized with what you're looking at when you open up Maya. It's not as intimidating as it seems. And if you follow along with this course, you will just pick up these things, and so that I won't have to walk through each little button kind of in a dry way. We'll take a project-based approach so that you'll get more familiar with the interface as we go along. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson where we will briefly cover manipulators and how to move stuff around in Maya. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, and let's quickly cover how to move things around in Maya. There's a couple things to understand, especially in 3D, that's important, and so let's jump right in and cover that. From the previous lesson, I still have the sphere here. If you don't have that, I can just delete that, and we can go up here to this polygon sphere and click that. You can also get to it by going to Create, Polygon Primitives, and Sphere. One other thing that's kind of fun with these menus is you can actually tear them off. So you can see there's this little option here. If I hover my mouse just above this, and most menus have this one has it, you know, most all of these menus have this little option here. So if I knew I was going to make a lot of primitives, a lot of spheres or something, just as an example, I can just click that and I'll have this kind of menu torn off. So now I can just click this a bunch of times, and if I open up my outliner, Windows Outliner, I can see I made a bunch of spheres. We only need one, so I'm going to shift select all of those below it and hit delete. And I'll select the sphere here. I'm also going to click and drag this outliner and let it hover here and let go so it'll kind of dock it in the window here. I'm going to close this menu that I had hovering, and no, I can get back to it, you know, up here if I want. now that we have the sphere, you can see that there's these kind of squares and different things going on here. So let's take a look. The way that we manipulate things in Maya is basically through several different tools. One of which, as you may have already seen, by hitting Q, you can get to the select tool, or you can select it up here. It's just the cursor option. I can select the object here just by left mouse clicking. I can also select it from the outliner here. So we've got the object selected, but now I want to move it. How do I move it? I can hit W on my keyboard to pull up the shortcut for the manipulator. I can also select it over here. You can see the move tool is what the tooltip says, and you can see as well that in parentheses it says W. So we can also see the shortcut is listed there. So now with the sphere selected, and if you can notice, even with the move tool selected, I can select different objects. You don't always have to have the select tool selected to select new things. You can have the move tool selected and you can still select stuff. So you can also click and drag to select things in a group. So now that we have this one thing, let's move it around. I can click any axis and it'll be isolated to that axis. I'll undo that. And you can see it's isolated because the axes manipulator turned yellow. If I click the vertical one, it turns yellow, or the z-axis, it also turns yellow. So now I know no matter if my mouse is going up and down or something weird, that it's only going to go along that axis. But if I want to have a free movement, I can just click in the middle and move the thing around wherever I want it. The other thing I can do is isolate on two axes, and that's what these little squares are here, that I can know I'm only moving it in the vertical and x-axis. I use these quite a bit actually, because in 3D space it's hard to tell where you're moving something sometimes. So it's hard to tell if that's actually vertically up or if I moved it back in space. So by selecting these, you can tell that I'm not moving it up. I'm moving it in the x and the z on this flat plane, this grid. And if you can't see this grid for some reason, if it didn't default to that, you can also turn that on here or turn it off if it's distracting. That's just one of these little options up here. So now that we know how to move things around, let's rotate it. So we can hit E on the keyboard, and similarly we can find it over here in this little toolbox window. And you can actually turn off these options from Windows, UI elements, and you can turn off the toolbox. Now you can see that disappears. If you find yourself not using those, it's nice to turn them off and you have more screen real estate for the viewport. But for now, since we're all beginners and we're just starting out, let's leave that up. So I'll go back to the UI elements, meaning user interface, and I'll go down to toolbox and bring that back. So with the rotation, it's very similar, that we can isolate different axes and they turn yellow, and we can click in the middle here and have a freeform option. One thing to keep in mind is, because we're working in 3D, watch the x-axes. If I click the z-axis and drag the red one down, now the red one is where the green one used to be. Did you see that? So I just undid it. So right now the green one is kind of going around, and if I bring the x-axis, the red one, down, now that's replaced it. So who's to say which axis is which now? Because before I rotated it, the green one was down here, the y-axis. But now because I rotated z, the x-axis is down here. So this option, this kind of view that we're seeing, is based on the object, right? Because the object is rotating, the axes are changing. And that's something very important to keep in mind, because that'll be important later in animation and stuff. So just keep that in mind, that because now we're in 3D, these things actually kind of matter. And we can control them in different ways. If we hold down E, which is the shortcut for rotation, if we hold down E on our keyboard and then click, left mouse click, we can drag to the world option. So now you can see the manipulator pop back to have the green going around here like it was before, even though the object is rotated. So what this is saying is we're now rotating based on the world axes, which never change, right? So even when we move an object around, you can see the manipulator itself is not changing. So we can always have the option, even if an object is rotated weird, to isolate based on the world axes. We just need to change that by holding down E and clicking and choosing this option. If we go back to object, you can see it still kept all those changes. And now based on the object's rotation, we can see the axes are moving all around, and so that's just something to keep in mind for later. So when we get into animation, this will be important, and I explain later in animation why that is important. So the other thing that just for myself I like to do is I like to only ever stay on the channel box unless I'm doing something very specific, because you can see this attribute editor here. You can see it says attribute editor right here on the side. It takes up a ton of room. There's just a lot of stuff going on and we don't need it. And so I like to keep the channel box open, because now we can see the values, we can zero them out, we can click and drag them and then hit 0 and zero everything out. This is way more useful when we're moving stuff around than the attribute editor. I'm also can slide that down to free up more space for the viewport. So similarly to the rotation axes being different, the move axes can also be different. So right now you can see even though the object is rotated, the axes are pointing relative to the world. So if we hold down W, similarly like we held down E earlier, if we hold down W and left click, we get the same option, right? World object. So now we can see it's following the rotation. So it's following the object axes now. So that's just two different ways to manipulate the same object, based on its own axes or based on the world axes. So that's important. The final thing we're going to talk about is the scale. If you hit R, or you can go over here and click the scale button or the scale tool, and we can scale uniformly, and we can also scale on axes. And that's pretty straightforward. So we've gotten this far and we haven't moved around anything. How do we move around? So we have an object, now let's move around it. I want to zoom into it. How do I zoom in? I can mouse scroll, which I don't use that much, but the other option I have is to hold down Alt and right click and then drag my mouse. And you can see I'm doing the same thing. I'm zooming in and out. And this is why you need a 3-button mouse, because now if you click and hold the middle mouse button, I can pan around. And then if I, still holding Alt, if I left click, I can rotate around an object. So with the combination of these three things, I can do all sorts of moves and zoom in on things. And say I get way out here and I can't really see what I'm working on, I can click and drag and select the thing. I can select it from the outliner, and then I can hit F. So hit F and I jump back to the selection that I have, and now I'm free to move around again and do all that. You can also get to that option from the view menu here. I can go to view, frame selection. One other thing that's very helpful is look at selection. So for example, if we're over here and I'm rotating around, I'm not rotating around the object anymore. And why is that? That's because my center of interest is somewhere over here and I can't rotate around the object. So if I want to rotate around the object, I can go look at selection. So the position of the camera didn't change, but now it's just rotated looking at the selection. And now I can pivot around that object. So that's one way to help control your camera. And if your camera gets too crazy, you can always select it from here. Select camera, which is whatever camera this viewport is, we'll select it. You can also select it from the outliner because we know it's PERSP. You can see on here PRSP, PERSP, perspective. And you can see now we have all the values here, and we can just zero those out if things got too crazy. And of course, now we're inside the sphere because we're at 0 world space. And now you can see I'm rotating from some crazy point out there. I can select my object, hit F, and now I'm rotating around it and I'm back. So that's a quick introduction on how to move, scale, rotate, and move the camera around. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome to this quick tip on how to snap at intervals using the manipulators in Maya. So if I hold down J, that's the hotkey. That's the big secret here. So if I hold down J, then I can get the manipulators to snap at a certain interval, move and rotate. But let's jump a little deeper in to see how we can control that more. If I hold down J, you can see under the tool settings, which you can open over here in the top right, the step snap options. So it says absolute and 1 for the move tool. If I hit E and move to the rotate tool, it says relative and 15. If I reset that tool, it'll go to absolute. So the default is probably absolute for you. And if you wanted to move relative, you would have to change it here in the drop-down menu. Now, what's the difference between that? So if we already have an object that has rotation value, we can see here 38.415, whatever. And if this is set to absolute, it will snap it to that interval of 15, of that absolute value of 15. If we wanted it to start at 38 and add 15 or take away 15 for every rotation we do, we need to set the step snap to relative by holding down J and then choosing relative. It will also remember what the last thing you chose is. So every time I hit J now, it will be relative. So just remember that's what's going to be happening. And so as we rotate that, we can see it's now adding to the number we already had. That's what relative means. Now, the other little quick way to do this, if you don't want to go into the tool settings, I've found and have used recently for making sure cameras are matching the world axis. If I hold down E and I go to gimbal mode, and then I hold down E again and go to discrete rotate, it will do a similar kind of a thing. Now it's going to be using whatever step snap options you have here, so just keep that in mind. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Welcome to the first class in 3D modeling. And the reason why I've structured it this way to have 3D modeling at the beginning of this complete beginners series is because simply we need something to work with later. So we might as well learn modeling up front at the beginning so that we can use models later down the course and have an understanding of what modeling is and why it's important. So to get going, I wanted first to describe some concepts about 3D modeling so you can begin to understand how to approach 3D modeling kind of from a theoretical standpoint so that you know what tools to use and how to approach whatever project that you come up with in your imagination and projects down the line and all that kind of a thing. So let's take a look at an example that I've created. All of these scene files that I'm working in are available to you for downloads. So this one might not be that useful because it's pretty basic, but it's going to be made available to you to download so you can follow along or open it up and dissect it and see what is inside. So I'm going to show you an example that I made real quick so we can cover two important concepts: hard versus organic modeling. So when I first describe this, you can probably already guess what it means, especially by looking at these two examples. And let me first quickly cover a couple little tricks that I like to use in Maya Viewport so we can look at this a little better. I don't know if it shows up in your video, but the edges of all of these polygons are not super smooth. They're kind of jagged and they're not anti-aliased, as we like to say technically. So there's actually an anti-alias button here that you can turn on for the viewport, and it is this little one right here. If I hover over it, and you can look at the bottom left, and it says multi-sample anti-aliasing, and then the tooltip will also pop up. So if we press that, and you can follow along and do this in your viewport, you can see that this is just for us. This doesn't affect the final render or the model itself or anything like that. This is just kind of to make it easier on our eyes as we're using Maya. So I like to turn on anti-aliasing, and I also like to turn on the ambient occlusion because you can't really see where these lines and gaps intersect on this model very well. So if we turn on ambient occlusion, watch this area right here where there should be lines popping up, but we can't see them because they're all facing the same direction. That's just how Maya is rendering it in the viewport. If we turn on ambient occlusion, which is this little button up here, which is just next to the anti-aliasing, we get ambient occlusion, which basically shows us areas of geometry that are close together and darkens those corners and inset areas. So now we can see that model a little bit better now that we have those two kind of viewport options turned on. So back to the topic at hand, hard versus organic models and modeling. And why is this important? It's important because we need to understand how we're going to approach a project or a model and the tools we're going to use to create it. So let's first talk about what hard versus organic really means. So you can kind of get an idea from these two examples. Hard is kind of straight surfaces, they can be curved as well. You can see there's a cylinder here, so it has a rounded surface on that side. But there's patterns here. It's things, mechanical things, things that are bolted together and made by humans typically are hard surfaces. So imagine a transformer here. And the organic shape on the right, there's no pattern really here. There's a lot of kind of swooping shapes, and it was made clearly not in the same way or with the same tools that the one on the left was made. You can see there's two very different type of models here. And just to kind of drive this point home, it's probably already pretty clear what these two things are, but it's good to just drive it home at this early stage of learning about modeling. So I have a couple pictures here that I wanted to show you. Just take a guess at what this would be, hard or organic models. And you can kind of tell it's an organic kind of shape. There's a lot of branches and fine texture and bark and leaves. And so, of course, this is going to be organic. And the type of tools we'll use to model something like this will be much different than modeling a hard surface, like me wearing the Darth Vader helmet. It has some curved shape to it, but it's a hard surface. There's not fine detail and texture on the surface itself for the most part. It's glossy, it's like a hard plastic. But if we're looking at this and looking at my hand, the hand would be on an organic model because it has very unique shapes. There's no pattern or uniformity to it at all. So it depends on what we're looking at in this picture, if it's my hand or the helmet, on what's going to be organic or considered hard surface. And just as another example, here are some more helmets that are all hard surface models. And for a kind of more historical example, you can see there's both in this as well. The kind of statues in the middle, in the foreground, and the inset on these at the front of this building are organic models. They have musculature, they have, flowing robes, and there's horses, but when you look at the building itself, it has very flat surfaces, very smooth. There's no, kind of organic detail unless we look at the top of the columns. We can see the kind of floral patterns that are incorporated there. So this is, again, marrying those two types of models in one example. So this is also a famous sculpture that's in the Vatican. And you can see the robes and all that type of thing would be considered organic, even though, organic, you might think of like nature or something like that. Clothes can be considered organic because they have these kind of flowing, irregular shapes in the folds of the model. And again, lastly, we have both together where this kind of structure on top of the mountain is a hard surface. And then when we look at the rock, we can clearly tell the difference between the pattern and the type of surface that this building is versus the kind of irregular surface of the rock. Okay, so I think we understand what hard versus organic means. And I meant to mess with this little cluster handle to show you also that, this is important to understand for later down the road when we're talking about rigging and animating. If it's a hard surface, we're probably not going to flex from the middle of this object. It's probably going to move all together, and that's going to, affect how we're going to do things later with rigging and animation. Whereas if it's organic, this thing could move all kinds of different ways, and we would need to rig and animate to reflect the type of organism this is, or shape, or model. So it's also important to understand later on what this implies for other aspects. So in this course, now we're going to jump into actually making things now that you have an understanding of how to use the Maya's interface and how we're going to approach modeling. We're going to make one hard surface model that we're going to continue to use throughout the course, and then we're going to model an organic character, a skeleton guy that we're going to use to animate later and make a pretty cool animation. So follow along in the next lesson and we'll get to creating stuff now. Thanks for watching. Welcome to this 3D modeling class where we will create a Ghostbuster trap so we can start to learn the 3D modeling tools inside of Maya. Anytime you start modeling something, you want to look at reference. In case you don't know what a Ghostbuster trap is, you can just Google it and find some images. And we're going to use this just as a template, not really as an exact match that we're going to try to get, but just, there's a kind of box here that has different knobs and a handle on it and that kind of a thing. And that's kind of the general kind of direction we're going to try to model this object in, so we can start to learn some Maya. So I'm going to switch back to Maya, and anytime you start using Maya, you want to set your project. This is something to remember from here on out. This isn't just some thing that you want to do sometimes. This is, from day one when I was learning Maya till you work in a big studio, you want to set your project. Big studios have their own way of doing stuff, but a small studio maybe, you want to set your project. If you go to File, we'll go down to Set Project. And the reason this is important is because anytime you have, later down the road, you have textures, say you're doing a cloth simulation and you want to cache that out, or all these other technical things that we'll get into later, we need somewhere for Maya to save all those things to reference into the scene. So in my directory, I've made a Maya folder, and I'm going to set that. And it will ask you to create a default workspace. And typically this just means, it's going to save, kind of unimportant stuff like what kind of view did you have open? Was it a perspective or a side view? And, what kind of preferences maybe you had for that workspace. So you can just say create default workspace, and you won't have to do that again. You'll have to do that the first time you set a project. We're also going to go to the project window, the other option here under project. You can see project in gray. We only have two options. We've already done set project. The project is set. So let's go to project window, and we get all of these different folder options here. And if you don't see these names typed out here, you can go to edit, reset settings, and it should fill all of those out for you. And this will create folders, like I mentioned a moment ago, for caches, for images, and mostly we're going to be using for scenes, because when we save a Maya file, if we just hit Command S like you would in a Word document or whatever, just to save the file, it's going to save a .mb or a .ma. And that's M for Maya and A or B, depending on if you save an ASCII or a binary file. But that's not that important right now. Let's just hit accept, and it'll make all these folders. So when we go to File Save, let's go File Save Scene, and because we haven't done it yet, it'll open up this dialog box. And now we have this current project. It knows where our current project is, and we have all those folders that it had listed out. And anytime we're saving a scene, we want to save it in the scenes folder. And you can see that it is under our project that I defined as Maya. And now I can name it whatever I want, and I can choose to be an ASCII or a binary, and it doesn't really matter, to be honest, for our purposes. So I'm going to name that Ghostbuster Trap and hit save. So now we have the project saved, and that way if we need to move the project to another computer, it will have reference a path to the project settings, so it'll know where the textures are or anything else like that. So let's get started and model this Ghostbuster Trap. So let's take a look at this reference, and we basically have a rectangle with a cylinder handle. So let's start with the most basic elements first, and then we'll add detail later. Because anytime you do modeling, whether it's hard or organic, let's start with the simplest shapes first and then add detail later. We don't want to start with the detail on really anything. And that goes, the same is true for animation, most art, you start with the basics first. So let's create the rectangle and the handle, because those are the biggest, most obvious things. So in Maya, there's a couple different ways we can create things. We have this shelf here, the poly modeling shelf, and there are curves and surfaces here, which, it looks like they have similar things, but these are called NURB surfaces. And these aren't very useful for modeling and animation. They sometimes are used for kind of just to create controls on rigs, to create paths to revolve a shape around, or constrain a camera to a path, or fly a plane down a curve path, something like that. But for our purposes, we're not going to be using NURB surfaces. We're going to be doing poly modeling, where we have vertices, edges, and faces. So let's create the rectangle. We can click this rectangle right here and zoom in by right-clicking and holding down Alt, and left clicking to rotate around, if you remember. We could also create that by doing the polygon primitives, and we could pop this off if we wanted to and create a bunch of these cubes. That's another way to do it. But now that we have this, we can go over to our channel box here, and we can see we have a polycube 1. And we can see it's called pcube 1 here, and it's also called pcube 1 here, and it's highlighted, so we know this is what's highlighted. And I point out these things because, you know, we can translate this thing around different ways, and that's reflected here. But there's also other options. When we pop this down, we can get subdivisions. So if we wanted more subdivisions, we can go to subdivision width, height, and depth, and those will do different kind of dimensions on this, depending on if we need more geometry. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's first make the basic shape. So I'll go to width, and I'll make this a little longer and a little wider and tall. So now we have something that approximates the size, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on the anti-aliasing and the ambient occlusion to help us visualize this. I'm also going to lift this up, and we can see, depending on the width, height, and depth, if I just change this to 5 and these to 2, then I know the height is 2, that this needs to go up 1 to be able to be sitting right on the floor, right? Because it's measuring from the center. Wherever our manipulator is, that's where it's measuring from. So if it's a height of 2 and this is in the middle, then it's 1 to the floor, right? From where the manipulator is. If we bring this down to the floor, it's going to be at 0. So that's one way to kind of know how it's calculating what these numbers are exactly. So we have that rectangle. Now let's create the handle. We can click the cylinder here and drag this up. You can hit W if you don't have the manipulator selected yet. You can hit E to rotate this over. And to get it exact, we can just type in 90. You can do -90 or 90. For us, it doesn't really matter right now. And we could scale this down, or we could use, similarly, these types of attributes over here. So we could reduce the radius, or we could, you know, just scale it down with the scale tool by hitting R. And let's move this to one side and move it up. And then we can make another cube a couple different ways. We could duplicate this one. We could hit Command D, and now we have another one that we can scale and do all these things to. But you can see when you duplicate, just with the shortcut, you don't have that option anymore, right? We don't have that polycube input that we had here. So sometimes it's nice to just use the basic tools to make sure that we have this history here that later we can go back in and change if we want to. So let's bring this here and scale it down a little bit. And let's talk about some ways to align things. So, you know, if we wanted to get this to be exactly on this edge, it might be kind of hard to use the manipulator, you know, back and forth. There are a couple different things we can do to move things around and be very specific. Of course, we can go up here and type in a number, but we could just be typing all day and, you know, we might not get exactly visually what it looks like. So to know that we have snapped to that, we can use the snapping tools. But the snapping tools go based off of where the manipulator is. So, for example, if I hold down V on the keyboard, that means vertice. It's going to snap to vertice. And just to show you what the components that we're dealing with, to know what a vertice even is, let me break this down even further. So if we take this square, I'm just going to isolate it with this little button here, isolate select. I right click. Now I can see and change my selection mode to edge, vertex, vertex face, face, or back to object mode, which is what we're currently in. We're in object mode. That's also denoted by this little button up here in the top left. If we want to go to component mode, we can click this button. And again, you know, it'll show that if you hold it down, or if you hover over it rather. And you can see the different kind of components that we can select here. And we can isolate those. So now we're selecting the lines. Or if we go back to this one and deselect the line, we get the vertice. So now we can edit the basic components of all the polygons here. And if we want to do this quickly, we can right click and hold, drag up and go to edge mode now. And now we can adjust the edges. So that just gives you a quick idea of what the components are that make up a polygon. So I just went to object mode to get back in so I can select the whole thing. I could also go up here and click this middle button to go back into object mode. I'm going to unisolate this now so we can go back to our model. So the next thing we need to understand is how to change where the manipulator is. So if I hold down V like I was describing earlier, and I middle mouse drag, if we click and hold on middle mouse, this is going to snap to vertices. You can see it's trying to snap to the corners of the box or the vertices of the cylinder. So, but we don't want the center to snap to it. We want the edge to snap to it. So we're going to need to change where this center pivot is. To do that, we can hold down D. And now we get a different type of manipulator here. And if we hold down V while we're holding down D, we can also snap the pivot to a vertice without the object moving, because we're just changing where the pivot is now. So if I let go of both, now we get the regular manipulator. If this doesn't come back, you can hit W to make sure that pops back to be the manipulator. So now when we move this, the whole thing moves around. Now what we can do is go and hold down V and middle mouse drag and isolate the up value. So we're only going to go up, and you can see it snapped upward. Now we can hold down the X axis and it will snap to the backside, which it seems like it has. So now we don't want this pivot here anymore. How do we get that back? That's not a big deal. We go to modify and we go down to center pivot. When we click this, now the pivot is back in the center, and we can move the pivot around later again if we want to, but now it's there. Also remember, you can see that the axis here is yellow. So if I was to start middle mouse dragging, it's going to be isolated on this no matter what I do or where I move my mouse, if it's middle mouse dragged. So, you just want to make sure that you understand how it's isolating these axes as you click them. That's one thing that, stumps a lot of people when they're just starting out, like, why can't I move this in a different axis? It's because we, selected that one and now it's thinking we want to isolate that. So this looks very basic right now, but I want to give you a quick introduction into how to create things, manipulate them, snap things around. And in the next lesson, we're going to take this further and start adding details and learn a few more modeling tools inside of Maya. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome to this lesson where we will continue making the Ghostbuster trap and learn a lot of new tools. So now that we have the basic shape done, let's choose a view and a piece of reference to try to add more detail in. So let's go back to our reference and look at a view like this. So I like to move my viewport to get a closer view of what the reference view is like. So it's kind of a 3/4 angle like this. Let's focus on this edge here, where there's a lower level here, and then it goes up, and there's a bevel, and there's a bevel here as well, and then it goes out. So we have this higher kind of rim and a lower area here. And it looks like the back area here is at the same level as this edge here. So let's just focus on that. Anytime you have reference in something that's kind of complicated, you're going to break it down into its components and simplify it and only work on little sections like that at a time. So let's do this kind of edge here. So I'm going to go back in, and if I go into my face mode, right clicking and going down to face, and I select that and move it around, I can't really move this and divide this in different sections. So I need edge loops here. And that's, if we go into edge mode, right clicking and dragging up, I can move individual edges. Well, we need more of those. We need an edge here to get that border. We need 2 edges here so that we can divide this section in half and it kind of have an angle between it. So let's add more edges. So to do that, we need to go to Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop. And what I like to do is to add tools that I'm going to use a lot to my custom shelf. So let's move over to our custom shelf and go down to the Mesh Tools and hold down Command and Shift, and then click Insert Edge Loop and watch your custom shelf. Boom. We get a new tool here so that now we don't have to keep going back to this menu. And if you do this by accident in the future, or you just want to delete it, you can right click and go to delete. So let's click that. And if we click and drag this, we can kind of make these 2 kind of areas where we're going to have the lower section and the upper section, and we have this angle here. So we need to have two edge loops, one here and one there, so that we can make this division. It doesn't really matter where they are exactly. We can move that around later, but let's just get them in there now. So now we have those two edge loops, and the other thing that we're going to need to add are the edge loops of the border here. So let's go back to our insert edge loop tool. You can also, I'm going to hit Q to get off of it, to just go to the select tool, and I'll go to object mode and select the object. You can see the last selected tool down here. So if I also hold down, well, I'm still selected on it. So let's go to the move tool. So now it's deselected. I can go back to the last one by selecting it here, or I can hit G is the shortcut to get back to that. So it'll do the same thing. So let's go to the move tool, and I'm going to hit G on the keyboard, and it'll go to the last used tool, which is the insert edge loop tool. So if we want to have this to be even on both sides, you can kind of try to eyeball it a little bit. And that might be, good for our purposes, but let's, we're all about learning new stuff. So let's get more precise. Let's go to the tool settings here, which is next to this button. It'll pop up the tool settings panel, and depending on the tool that we have selected, it'll give us different options. If I change the tool here, you can see this menu will change every time I have a new tool. So with the insert edge loop tool selected, which I can get to there, or I can hit G. There's a bunch of different ways, which is kind of the theme of Maya. There's a lot of different ways to do the same thing. So it's just whatever you're more comfortable with or is quicker to work with for you. So now that we have this, let's go to the multiple edge loops option. And I've set it to 6, and let's go to 6. And if I click here and I drag, it won't matter because we're doing a equal distance from each other. So when I let go, you can see now we for sure have the same distance from the outside edge for these new edges that I made. But what if we don't want these interior edges? If I go to edge by right-clicking and dragging, and keep in mind, you do need to have your cursor over the object that you want to change to. If I was to do this up here and go to edge, it'll change to this object, and we don't want that. We want that object to stay in object mode. So let's click this and go to edge mode. And if I select this now, it's just going to select that one little section. But if I double click the edge, it'll select the whole edge loop if it goes all the way around. If it doesn't go all the way around, it won't select the whole thing. But okay, so if I hit delete now, because I don't want that, now you can see it still has a division here, right? There's got to be a vertice here. Look, there's a vertice there. We don't want that vertice. So I could go through and delete each of those vertices like this, but they're on all the corners, and it's kind of stupid to have to do that. So let's undo this and get that edge loop back. And I'll show you the right way to do it. So we'll go to edge loop. We will double click each edge and hold shift to select more than one edge. And now I'll hold down shift and right click and go to delete edge. And this is how you delete edges from now and forevermore. Okay, so use this because it'll get the vertices as well. So now this is one solid edge. It's not still divided up in a weird way. Cool. So the next problem we need to deal with is the fact that these kind of faces here should be at the same level, right? They should be down here somewhere. And not just those, but these here, right? Because we noticed in the reference, this kind of back area looks like it's at the same level. It goes across this. You can kind of see this little edge here, or, even this is a better view. Look at this kind of back edge. It's flat here, and then it looks like it lines up to this flat edge. So it's more like this is an extrusion than anything else. And, there's a bunch of different ways you could go about doing this. We could actually just select these two and extrude those up, which is probably the easiest thing to do. So let's go ahead and do that. Conversely, you could extrude everything else down, like I had selected earlier. And the other fun thing you can notice about Maya, as I'm undoing, it's reloading in the last selections. So it includes that in its undo history, which is kind of nice. So we could extrude these down, or we could just extrude these two sections up. Let's go this method because it's the less amount of things that we have to do, which is always good in 3D. So let's extrude these up. So to extrude, it's another tool like we did the insert edge loop tool, but this one is in the edit mesh option here. and I'm going to Command Shift it because I'm going to use this more than once probably. And to that point, there's a ton of options in here to do stuff. And this is why I like adding things to my own custom shelf, because I'm not going to use most of this stuff, right? We're not even probably going to cover, you know, half of this stuff because you just don't use it that much. So I like to create my own shelf of the tools I use the most, so I don't have to keep hunting through all these things up here. So I'm going to click the extrude tool, and I'm also going to turn off this kind of tool settings here so we get more view area space here. And so now we have this little window, and that gives us options for our extrusion. You can also see those options here in the inputs. Kind of similarly when we were, you know, changing the size of our original cube, we had that input down here, the polycube input, and it's still there, right? 5, 2, 2. Those are the things we changed in the previous lesson. And so it keeps all these inputs. You know, when we added those split edges, what they call split ring, I don't know why they changed the type of language they're using. Instead of saying insert edge loop, you know, for the tool, and now here they call it a split ring. So this is the history of what we've done on the object. You know, you can see we added edges to this, and then we deleted some, and now we've extruded it. So it keeps the history of the object. There's also what we'll do at the end is delete all the history, so it's a lot cleaner when we're done with the model. So let's, you know, there's multiple ways to use this. We can just click and drag this. We could also, you can see it changes the local Z translate. We can also click and drag this. You can see it also changes here. We could also change the thickness, is pretty similar to the local Z translate, that is. Does kind of the same thing. And if you're having trouble clicking, and also, you know, remember if you're doing something like this, you can click and drag on it here. You can also middle mouse drag it out here. And if it's going too fast, it's probably because of this little pie chart thing. And you can change the speed at which it moves. So this is the slowest one, and if I needed to go faster, I can click that a few times and it goes up. And we don't need it in this little window. It's actually also changing the one over here. You can see that if I change this one, or if I change that one, it'll update the other. So you can get it to it in two different places, and this is going to be super, super handy. Animating, modeling, this is a very useful tool to get more precise. So let's, you know, make the thickness something like that. Now the problem we've encountered is we have this kind of stair step look instead of a kind of straight edge, the kind of diagonal that we're going for. If we look at the reference, let's get a better picture. Okay, now that we have a better picture, we can see that this is a slope. It's not a stair step. So how do we resolve that? Let's go about it and learn another new tool. So let's go to the face, and let's just delete these faces. And also be careful you're not selecting faces through it. This can be a common thing. You can see if I drag my mouse over here, I'm actually selecting things on the bottom side. And to double check that, you can also just go into wireframe mode. Let's hit 4 on our keyboard, and now we're in wireframe. So you can kind of see through the object and make sure you're not selecting something on the opposite side. So let's delete that. And let's go back into the shaded mode and hit 5. You can also get to these modes up here by toggling through them. This is a texture mode. We don't have texture, so that one doesn't matter. So now we have these holes that we need to fill. We'll go to Mesh Tools and go to Append to Polygon. And I'm going to Command Shift, add that to my custom shelf, select it, and now you can see there's kind of these highlighted borders. I don't know if that's super obvious in your view, but this is a thinner kind of green and this is a thicker green. So that's telling us where we can select. And if we hold our tool out in the viewport, or, you know, if we look down here in the bottom left, it'll say Append to Polygon tool, activate the object, then click on the first border edge to append on. So let's select one of these edges and then just select the other. And now we have this kind of bridge that we made. And let's hit enter and do the same for this other side. And remember, if we hit G, we can pull up the last use tool, and we can do the same thing and make a little bridge here. And let's hit G again and do the same for these holes. And you can see that we just have to do that for 2 edges, and it'll fill in the third edge. And let's hit G again. Whoops. I selected the wrong thing. So I just hit backspace and hit G again. Whoops. See, and it's trying to go to another who knows why it's trying to go out there, but I didn't pick up I'm trying to hit that edge. So one thing I like to do is go to a view where there's kind of nothing behind this thing, right? So that's just pretty much the only thing I can select if you're having trouble with it. And hit enter. And it looks like it didn't undo that goofy thing that it did. So I'm gonna undo that, hit G, select the object, select the edge, and there we go. The other thing to keep in mind, let me just hit backspace to undo that. These purple things are arrows, so it's telling you the edge direction. So if I select an edge, you can see the arrows are pointing in a certain direction. They're going in this direction. They're huge, so it's kind of hard to see. But I think that's, if I chose this one, I might still do it. But if you have a problem where you have more than 2 or 3 edges, look at those purple arrows and see which direction it's going in if you're having trouble making that work. So now we have this type of slant to our object. How cool is that? And we have this back area is at the same level as those. So in this lesson, we learned the Insert Edge Loop tool, the Poly Extrude tool, the Append to Polygon tool. We learned 3 new tools. We learned a lot. And those are tools you're going to use over and over again. So in the next lesson, we're going to continue to refine this. We're going to bevel some edges and keep adding more detail. Thanks for watching. Welcome to the next lesson where we will continue adding detail to the Ghostbuster trap. And in this lesson, we're going to add some bevels and add this kind of front panel here. So we'll add more geometry to it and details. And let's focus on this bevel for right now. So it looks like this is a pretty rounded edge, but that this edge maybe isn't as rounded as that one, but it is rounded there. And this one is maybe a little sharper. So this could be because this is a homemade thing and it's not exactly, exact machined as it would be if it were a real thing. So depending on if you want to divide these bevels up, you can do that and do them separately. I say we just do them all together so that it's a little quicker, and you can add more detail or do the bevel separately if you want at a later time. The one thing I want to do before I do that as well is to finish out this kind of bottom section. You can see that this goes down to a kind of footprint that doesn't just go straight down to the floor. So there's this kind of inset area that we can do with the Poly Extrude tool and adding some edge loops and things that we've learned. So let's go to the Insert Edge Loop tool, and I'm going to go to the tool settings over here to make sure that we're back on relative distance. And I'm just going to choose one kind of area here and use that. And then I'm going to go to the face mode and select all the faces. Whoops, I'm still on the Insert Edge Loop tool, and I'm going to turn off the tool settings now. So let's go to the face mode. We'll choose Q or W, whichever, to select the faces, and I'll hit 4 to make sure those are all the ones selected. Go back to 5, and now I will choose the Poly Extrude tool, and I'll just pull in the thickness a little bit. Whoop. You can see we have Keep Faces Together off, so let's turn that on. And as this goes in, it'll all go together. The only thing with this is it's also going up. So that's the only issue there, is the fact that this is going up. If we go to the front view, holding down spacebar, clicking and dragging from the middle, you can see it's going up. So we can offset that later. Let's just bring the thickness in. So it's not just the same. So that looks about right. It looks like it goes in and maybe there's another layer here. So let's deal with that. Let's go to the front view, and I'm going to go to the vertice mode, and I'm just going to select all the bottom vertices. I'll click W, and then I'm going to hit X now. I'm going to hold down X on my keyboard, and that will snap to the grid because I want this on the floor, so it'll snap to the grid. Now let's add another edge loop so that we can kind of get this bottom section out and do the same thing we just did. Let's go to face mode, select all the faces. Whoops, again, I'm still in the edge loop mode, so I'll hit Q to get off of that. Select all of the faces, go to the extrude, and let's just extrude this out. Oh, and we want to keep faces together on, as we did before. Let's have that somewhere in between kind of the front and insert edge here. Now I'll go back to the vertices, select them, and hold down X to drag them up to the floor again. So now we've created, whoops, now we've created this kind of inset kind of footprint here. And I want to do that before we do the bevel so that we can bevel all of these together. Let's go back to this. It looks like this is fairly rounded at the bottom. So let's select the edges we want to bevel and start beveling. We'll go to the edge mode. I'll select this edge and that edge, this edge and that edge. So we're just going through and holding down Shift to select more than one edge. And let's see what we're going to do down here. Let's do these corners later because it won't be as similar to these, or kind of the same distance of an edge loop. So let's just do these top ones. So let's go to Edit Mesh, Bevel. I'm going to Command Shift click it to add it to our shelf. And now we can see it's starting to bevel the edges. Now, this one doesn't have a tool that pops up. So we can go over here to the Poly Bevel input and it'll pop it up for us here. So we can change the fraction, which is how far it is. We can change the segments, which we will need many more. And if you can see I'm clicking and dragging, not a lot's happening. It's because the pie chart here is too slow. So let's speed that up so that I can add more sections here. Cool. So we've rounded those two out. And the thing I want to do actually is to move these closer together. So I'm going to go to the edge. I'm going to double click this. You can see because now this is a triangle. So in Maya, it only likes quads. Everything in this model so far is a quad, meaning 4 sides, except for this. So when I double click it, that's why it doesn't select this edge loop, because it stops here on this triangle. So just be aware that Maya does not like triangles in that regard. So now that I have this selected, I just want to move this a little bit closer. So it's a more of an extreme angle, and select these edges again. Cool. Let's hit the Poly Bevel, and we'll click on the input over here, and let's hit T to bring up the menu. And let's add more segments to this. And that's looking pretty good. So if we go back to this, we can see also along this edge, it's not perfectly flat. So we could actually add more bevel to these edges as well. So let's go to the edge tool and we'll double click this. And let's select all the edges, the kind of outward facing edges here of the object. So I'm just holding down Shift and selecting them. And I'm going to do these bottom ones later. So let's deselect those. Cool, so I'll Shift select this edge. Deselect by, I'm holding down Control to deselect things. Sorry, I didn't mention that. So double click that and go in here. Select these. Control click, drag, deselect that. And let's bevel these edges as well. So we'll go back to the bevel tool, and that looks a lot better. Let's hit T to pull up the tool, and we can change this fraction if we want. Let's add maybe one more segment in there. And so the fraction will stop based on how much room it has. You can see it's running into this edge here. So it can't go any further than that. And I think that's okay for us, but just know that in your case, if you wanted to go further, it can't go further than that edge. So you'd have to move this edge before you beveled so it could go further than that. So now we have a much nicer edge here. If you look at these, because we didn't bevel this one looks very CG, very exact and hard. And this one is just a tiny bit softer, and it adds a lot to the model. Okay, so the other thing that we run into here are a normals situation. Normals are how Maya knows what direction a face is facing. So if we go to display and we go down to polygons, we can turn on face normals. I'm just going to pop this out because I'm going to turn them off here and again in a second. So let's click face normals. And now you can see we get all these green little arrows. So that tells you which direction the faces are pointing. And for the most part, they're all pointing in the right way. But I bring all of this up because it will affect how Maya views and shades the object in this kind of almost fake like shaded mode that you can see in the viewport. So I bring this up because I'll turn that off just by clicking face normals again. Close this. You can see this is kind of shaded in a weird way. If we click off of here, it's kind of, there's this gray area here. It's white. It's like, what's happening here? This looks weird. So there's a couple of different things we can do. And first off, we can clean up the geometry a little bit if we wanted. You can see here, we have an issue that this has a face. So I'm hitting F to zoom in on it and zooming out. This has a face. It's not connecting here. It should connect here. So there's no edge here. So it's like, it's trying to drag this face over this thing without an edge. And so that's why this one is shaded weird. You can see it has like a dark area on the top here. And then it's lighter here, but this one doesn't look the same way. So we get this hard edge. So if we go to the multi-cut tool, let's go to the mesh tools and we'll go down to multi-cut and we'll command shift that, add it to our shelf. If I click that, I can select a vertice and select another one and it'll cut this in half if I hit enter. So now we have room for that to describe what's actually happening. If I select off of here, you can see it's still shaded in a weird way, and we can fix that in a second. But before we do that, we need to add the geometry in here so it knows how to describe that area. So we go to the multi-cut tool. Let's do that to this side as well and hit enter. Now, if I go to mesh display, and let me zoom in here so we can see this change. If I go to mesh display and hit average, you can see it changes the whole model. If I go to mesh display conform or set to face, I think is what we want. Now it looks right. So that's just one way to fix that. Now that we've set the normals to be to the face, we can see that we're kind of getting these hard edges here on the curved areas. Whoa, my computer thinks I'm right clicking when I'm not. We get these hard edges here. You can kind of see this gradient from dark to bright here and these stepped kind of colors. And to get rid of that, let's select the object and go to soften, harden edges. And when we do that, it will soften and harden the right edges in the right areas. So now we do not have those weird kind of colored areas here that we were getting before. So that's a way to get around that and to get these smooth areas to look smoother. So we've done quite a bit in this lesson with beveling edges. So I'm going to go ahead and end this one here. And in the next lesson, we'll start to add this detail of this panel to the object. Thanks for watching.
Hey, thanks for watching this free course. I just want to remind you that this is part of a larger course you can take, and you can find that at the link in the description. Give me a thumbs up too, a little like if you are enjoying the course so far and you want to keep this up on YouTube. Go ahead and give me a like and a subscribe, and let's keep going.
In this lesson, we will continue to create detail on this Ghostbuster trap. So in the previous one, we did some beveling of the edges. Let's finish that up. But first, I noticed that at some point my model got uncentered. You can see that it's not totally centered up here. So all I need to do that happens is hold down spacebar, click in the middle here, go to my right view, and I can see that it is not lined up with the handle. So I can just hold down X, and with the move tool selected, I can just snap it to the middle. So now that I can tell that it is centered up with everything and we're ready to continue. So if anything like that happens, it's no big deal, just figure it out and snap it back to the center. You can, change the pivot if you need to, all that kind of stuff. So don't feel like you're always stuck or, you can't, change something or whatever. It's just a matter of getting comfortable with these tools and starting to use them. So one thing I want to do is add this type of a bevel here to more areas quickly. So and it looks like maybe that's what I did. I middle mouse dragged this while I had the manipulator tool selected. Is probably how it got off centered. So just be careful about that. And you can always fix that. So let's select the edges here, right clicking, going up to edge, and we will go through and shift select the edges that we would like to bevel. And double clicking, it looks like I accidentally didn't have shift held down, so I'll hold down shift and just double clicking these and these corners. I'm going to do the bottom corner separate because I want those to have a different kind of bevel. And let's do this one as well. And this one. And these might not be super clean because we're doing them separate from the sides. Ideally, we do these together because their intersection might be kind of dirty. So we'll see if that works at all. If it doesn't, we can just skip that, and you know, you can undo the bevel from earlier and get back to that. So now that we have that selected, we can go to bevel, and yeah, you can see on these corners, if we don't do these together, then they're kind of wonky a little bit. We can always fix that if we need to. And it looks like I missed one edge here as well. So let's go back to bevel. And then let's go to the poly bevel input here that we created. We can hit T to bring up the options here if we'd like and resize this to make it more clear. And let's go to a higher fraction here and add at least one segment. And let's go to object mode so we can see that and deselect it. Looks like it did a pretty good job. The only thing we need to fix down here is this kind of intersection. So if, you know, you happen to do these bevels separately and there's some wonky thing like this, you know, this is modeling. This is, you know, creating things on the fly, making different decisions, and then fixing things when they're not working. So what we can do is just add a little multi-cut tool here, and we can add that edge in. We can do that to the bottom here as well, and hit enter. And if I go to the vertice mode here, and I zoom in here, just so I can hit F to have something to focus in on. We're so close to it that it's kind of hard to see. Let's go to the edge mode, and let's just delete these edges that we don't need. Actually, we need these in the center, so I'm control clicking and dragging those. So now I'm going to go shift, right click, delete edge, and now we have that. So let's go to the vertex mode and just drag this up. And if we want to make it precise, we can go to a camera view that's orthographic so we can see it in line with everything else. And we can just drag it up so it's in line with this line here. We could also vertex snap it, holding down V, and now we know it's in line. We can see the ones down here also need to be fixed. I'm going to leave that for now and let you fix that if you'd like, but that's how you fix, you know, intersections like that. It looks like that one needs to be fixed as well. So I'm just holding down spacebar and clicking in the center to get to the right camera, and holding down V to drag that to the right spot. And then going back to perspective with the holding down spacebar, dragging, clicking and dragging. So that's how we fix intersections like that when when something like that occurs. And again, that's just part of modeling, being flexible, because, you know, say you had a supervisor and now they want to add more bevels and you've already done all this beveling, you know, things don't happen perfectly from one step to another. So you need to be able to adapt and know the tools well enough to adjust the model as needed. And again, I'm just going to leave that one now for time's sake. It looks like we need to do that on every corner, but for time's sake, let's just leave that. And let's look at these edges here. I want to just select the corner pieces, and I want it to go all the way to the edge there on the inside. So let's control click deselect areas that we don't need and double check that we have everything selected. And let's get this side as well. Just double clicking and then control clicking it to deselect. Whoops. Looks like I zoomed out in the wrong spot. So one thing I just did, sorry, it's a habit. I'm used to using these tools, so I'll have to slow down here. I'm not entirely sure what just happened. The view just went away. So the first thing I did was hit the bracket button on the keyboard. And so that'll just go back to your previous camera view. And so we can toggle between wherever the camera went. I'm not entirely sure. I might have hit A, which is frame everything. And, you know, who knows why it went that way. This is just part of working in 3D sometimes. But yeah, just hit bracket and you can get back to the previous camera view if you're ever, you know, missed where you went or something like that. Things go haywire sometimes. And yeah, if you know the tools well enough, it's not that big a deal to just get back to where you were. Okay, so we have those done. So I did those separately because I'm going to go back to polybevel here, hit T. We could also do it from this menu, but I just like, it just looks better to me to use this one, floating one. Let's increase the fraction. And I did this separately because I wanted to do these separately. And it looks like we're going to be prohibited by this interior piece here. So it's getting stuck right here. I can't go any wider than that. So let's undo this. And we have this selection, and instead of remaking this selection, let's create a quick select set. So that's just a way that we can get that selection back without having to redo that all over again. So we'll go to create, we'll go down to sets and quick select set. And we'll just say bevel edges. We don't even have to name this because we'll probably just delete it here in a minute. And we'll say, okay. So now we can unselect it and we can save that selection for later. So let's delete these kind of edges here so that we can have a greater range in the bevel. And again, you know, this may seem like tedious work, but this is just modeling. This is part of modeling. If you want to get into modeling, whoa, what's happening here? If you want to get into modeling, this is just part of modeling to, you know, like I was saying a minute ago, to kind of run into problems and then solve them. So we have all those selected. So I'll hit Shift, hold down Shift and right click, get to delete edge. So now when we go to the bevel edges, let's just go to select, quick select sets, bevel edges. Now we have that selection. So we learned something in that process of problem solving. So now that we have that, we can go back to the bevel tool. And when we pull out the fraction here, we should be able to go a lot further. Oh, no, we're stuck by those. So I think what we have to do here is, because we're still stuck by these interior pieces, we're going to have to create, we're going to have to deselect this line here. So let's just undo this and control drag that. So again, you know, anytime I'm modeling something in my head, I have an idea of how it should work, but you know, it's not entirely certain that's going to be the case. So let's go to polybevel. Now, here we go. So let's zoom in and let's see if we can increase the segments here. And let's go to object mode and see how that looks. It's looking pretty good. So one thing you might notice is this kind of line here, and I think that's because we don't have the geometry here to support this area. So one thing we can do is go to the multi-cut tool and click here and go to the edge that's missing and do the same for this side. And now when we go to the object mode and click off, it's still there, maybe not as bad. So now we have the corners beveled here. Let's move on to creating the panel on the right side. So let's go and create a new object. We'll go to Poly Modeling Shelf, create a cube, and bring it up. Most things that ever start to get modeled in Maya start with a cube or a sphere, something simple, and then you add complexity to it later. So I'm just using the scale tool to change the size and get it roughly in the right spot. So we can just we can do the same thing that we did before. Let's hold down D and V and vertex snap it to the edge, to its farthest edge, and then go back to the manipulator mode and then hold down V with just the normal move tool, and it'll snap right to that face. And so now also when we scale it, it should scale from that face. So we don't have to worry about like going inside of the trap itself. And this is important to do, to have a separate piece, because when we add materials later, we want to have a different object. You can see over here, it's called P Cube 3, and we can start naming these things if we want to clean this up. But basically, this is a separate object. We can see it in the outliner, so we know it's a separate object. So it can have a different material, because if we look at the reference, this is a kind of aluminum metal, and this is like a painted black or something. So it's good to have those separated out. Okay, so let's go to the edges here. Let's right click, go to edge mode. I'll just select everything and bevel everything together. And if we go back, I can click it here, but I like to go back to the custom shelf, so it keeps everything a little organized. And go to poly bevel, and let's just increase the segments to 2. And right click to go to object mode, and clicking and dragging, of course, to the object mode option here, and letting go. So now we have that. Let's look at creating the screws here. We have these kind of semicircular ends that go in, and then this looks like a cylinder type of a screw. So let's create this and show you one other tool called a Boolean. So let's go to the poly modeling shelf, create a sphere, and let's just group all of this. And so I'm shift selecting everything in the outliner and hitting Command G, and that will group everything. We can call this trap or GB trap, and hit enter. And now I can, with that selected, I can hit Command H, or sorry, I can hit Control H, and that'll hide it. So now I can focus on what I'm working on here. You can see it kind of graded out here, so we know it's hidden. And to get that back, we can just hit Shift H. Okay, so with pSphere, let's create its screw and inset here. So let's scale this down, hitting R, scale it down, and I want to select all the faces on the outside here. So I'm going to click and drag and select all those faces. Then I'm going to go to the custom shelf and go to extrude. And with keep faces together off, I'm going to increase the thickness. And I'm going to hit the little pie chart here to make that go slower. And I can actually look at this from a top-down view, holding down space, clicking, and going to top view. And I can see how far out I want this to actually affect the screw head here. So something like that, I think. And I'm going to go back to perspective and right-click to object mode. Hit the R for scale and scale up in the Y here. Drag this down, and we want this to go in as far as we think we need the screw to go. So maybe pretty far, something like that. We can go to wireframe mode by hitting 4, and we can see it doesn't go all the way to half. So, you know, because this is sticking out at least half and it's more pancake shape, we could actually just go ahead and do that with the sphere. Let's go into the right view, and let's go to face mode, right clicking on the sphere and going to face. And also, if that ever happens where you accidentally go into UV mode and now you're in a whole new menu, you can just hover back over the one you were in, the little gray dot here, and it'll go back to that menu. Or you can just let go of right click while you don't have anything selected, and it'll get you back to this. So let's go to the faces, click and drag all the faces below the half here. We can see this is kind of our ground plane, or 0. So we can hit just delete on that. For faces, you don't have to do anything special. You can just delete them with the delete button on the keyboard. So let's go back to object mode, and then we can scale this down, hitting R, scale this down to be more pancake shaped. Now we can move this down to be something like this. We don't want to go all the way through, so we want to leave a little gap here at the bottom. So let's go back to perspective, holding down spacebar, and then let's hit 5 to go back to shaded. And with the sphere selected here, and then this one selected, we can go to Mesh, Boolean. And Booleans are basically a way to subtract or add one object to another. So now that we have that done, we want a difference. So let's click that, and boom, we have a difference, and we have our screw. So that's super helpful. You don't have to model every little corner, and it's like, you know, with these edges on a sphere, how do you actually even get that? So it's nice to have a Boolean every once in a while. They can be kind of wonky, and you do have to select things in the correct order. So if I didn't do it in that order, if I selected, let me hit Q to get back to my tool, and sometimes my Maya has a little buggy thing where I need to shake the viewport a little bit or use the viewport, and it'll let me start to use tools again. So you might run into similar bugs when you're using it. So I'll shift select it in a different way. Now you can see it does the reverse. So you want to make sure you're selecting it in the proper order and that you're using the right Boolean. And that's why I tore off the menu here, because it's nice to have it in case you screw up to, you know, just go ahead and use it again and again. So we can close that out. We have this made, and now let's bring our trap back. And also, now that we're looking at the outliner, you can see it creates all this history when you do a Boolean. You know, if we look at the input over here, we deleted the faces, so it says delete component. We extruded, you know, it's combining the inputs from the two pieces, and then you have this Boolean. So it gets really messy, and then it creates these empty shapes. And those are quite useless and can actually be harmful in the future. So when you do a Boolean and you know you've done it and it's, you know, you're done using it, it's good to go ahead and clean up that piece of geometry and delete the history. So go to Edit, Delete by Type, and History. You want to make sure you do not do Delete All by Type. When it says Delete All, it means everything in your scene, not just what you have selected. So this is a very important distinction right now. These are not the same thing, okay? Delete by type is what you have selected. Delete all by type is everything in your scene. We just want to do what we have selected. So we're going to go to delete by type and go to history. Now you can see all those inputs are gone and all those empty groups over here are gone. So it's much cleaner to do once you do a Boolean like that. So let's click this and hit Shift H to bring it back, unhide it, and click the sphere here. And let's bring it over and rotate it 90 degrees. By clicking that, typing it in the channel box. And let's vertex snap the pivot, holding down D and V to the bottom here. So then we can vertex snap, holding down V to the front face of the object. So now we can slide it around knowing it's on the front. And because we have ambient occlusion on up here, we can see it kind of has this shadow effect around it. So we know, you know, kind of where it is in space a little better. I'm also just going to save real quickly because it's doing crazy things. Anytime Maya's doing crazy things, it's good to save. And of course, you can follow along with all these lessons in the according numbered scene. So we're in number 4 right now, so you can pick up where we left off there and use the same model in the same scene. So I'm just going to bring that up here somewhere and scale it down. And that works pretty good for me. So now we've started to add this panel, and we can add a couple more details, like these cylinders are something super easy to do. Let's just create a cylinder, bring it over, rotate it down 90 degrees. So I like to do it here first, so it tells me which axis I'm doing it, axes I'm doing it over here. So then I know which one I need to type it into up there. The other thing I want to do is add more subdivisions to the caps. So I'm going to untoggle down the input here for the cylinder and go to subdivision caps and just say, you know, let's just say 3 for fun. And the reason I'll show you here in a second, because we need to adjust the model a little bit. I'm going to drag this out, scale it down, move it over, move it up, do all this fun stuff that you know how to do now. And let's just scale it down and then drag it out. Let's see how they're kind of far apart and maybe a little thicker. one really interesting thing is isolating where you're scaling from. This is something I use all the time, and I didn't know years later until I was using Maya. So into using Maya, I didn't know this. So say I want to scale the radius of this thing. You know, I could do this, and then I could do this, and I could do this, and do this, and I'm not entirely sure if it's keeping the right circle shape. So, you know, if I don't want to scale in this direction, but I want to scale in the other two directions, all I have to do is hit Control and click and use that. And now it's isolating those other two ones. You can see those, the red and blue things are going up and down, but the one I'm clicking on isn't. This is a huge, huge, helpful little tip that took me a couple years to figure out, and now you know it in the first hour of learning Maya. So this is the benefit of taking these kinds of classes. You can learn what took me quite some time to learn. So the next thing I want to do is go into edge mode, and the reason why we added these caps is I'm just shift and double clicking them to get the edge loops. Is if you look here, you can see it kind of has this bevel. We could actually bevel it if we wanted to, but let's just have a little more control over it in our own way and scale these two edge loops in a little bit. And it does pretty much the same thing. So now we've added that detail ourselves, and we could even go further and bevel these two edges. Now that we've done the kind of larger move, why don't we just select these, shift clicking, double clicking, and then if we go to bevel, I don't want it to look super rounded out, so I'm going to reduce the fraction quite a bit. And right click and go to object mode so I can kind of see it. It looks a lot better. And I'm going to duplicate this by hitting Command D on the keyboard, going to the manipulator tool by hitting W, and just drag another one down. And now we have those two red things that are, who knows what they are, on the side of this Ghostbuster trap. So you can also see we have another screw down here in the bottom right. So let's just duplicate this, Command D, and we'll just drag this down and over here. And now we have that. So the next thing we're going to do is create the knob here that's in the center piece. And you can see that it has these kind of ribs around that is going to create a, we're going to need a special type of technique to model that in, a repeating pattern over a kind of curved surface. And so in the next lesson, we'll cover that and add more detail to this. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned quite a bit in this lesson. All right, see you then. Okay, welcome to this lesson where we will create the knob that we see here in the reference. And I want to make this its own lesson because it's going to use a very unique technique. And between the previous lesson and this lesson, I also added a few more details using the same techniques we've already learned. So I wanted to save some time and not, handhold you through every single thing if we've already covered that type of a topic. And I'm going to do that throughout the course so we can speed this up and you're not having to follow and relearn the same things over and over again. So the things that I added were bevels to the handle and to the kind of extension here. And I added another plate and these screws. The only thing to notice and to remember that I maybe haven't covered about bevels, when I was making this, I was resizing it and doing all kinds of things. Same thing with this beveled edge here. And if I was to start to scale something that I've already beveled, the bevel itself is going to scale as well. You can see the distance of those edge loops are getting further and further apart. And it's messing with the bevel. And I don't want that, right? When I'm scaling something, I want the bevel to be the same. So if you're going to scale something, you probably need to go into vertex mode and move the vertices. Instead of scaling this out, you want to move them. So all the bevel is maintained. This is the same bevel distance that we had when it was this short of a piece. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're scaling anything that's been beveled, that's not uniformly scaled, I should say, because if it's uniformly scaled, then it's going to scale up and it's all going to get bigger together. And if that's what you want, that's okay. But just know that bevel is going to get bigger if you scale the whole thing up together. So let's get into making this little kind of knob here. And non-uniform shape as well. It's not a cylinder all the way around. It has this kind of point over here. So let's go and create a cylinder because we've got to start with the most basic things. And I'm also going to group, you can see these screws also have these kind of black pieces, or what are going to be black pieces, if you can look at the reference here. So I included those as well, and then I grouped them. So I'm going to just middle mouse drag, I'm shift selecting everything and middle mouse dragging that into the main group, GB Trap. And we can do that with everything else as well. Let's just shift select everything that we're not currently modeling and middle mouse drag that and let go over the main group. So now we can select that and hide it with Control H. And now we can look at this cylinder. And what we want to do is pull out one kind of point. So I'm going to delete some edges. And before I do that and start messing with the history of this thing, I want to add a cap here. And that's important for cylinders, at least, because if you start messing with this thing and then later you want to add a cap, it won't do it because you've messed with the history of the object. So, get this cleaned up first because you won't be able to change it a ton later if you're messing with components like we're about to do. So I'm basically going to select, double click and shift and double clicking, all of the edges. I don't know why that's not selecting. All the edges here, except for the one in the center, I just skipped because that's going to be the one we're going to pull out. So I'm going to hold down Shift, right click, and go to Delete Edge. And now we have the point that we want. And it looks like it comes out kind of far, so we can just click and drag this out. Something like that. And we can double click these and maybe just scale them in a little. Or what we could do is add some more edge loops here and scale them out. So let's go to the edge loop tool on our custom shelf, click it, go to the tool settings here, make sure we're on multiple edge loops. And yeah, let's try 4, clicking here. And it looks like it's kind of the same distance. I'm looking at the distance here with the distance here. It's maybe a little bigger. So let's go 5. Whoops, just type that in. Click one time. That looks a lot closer. So now we have kind of remade that kind of uniform distance here. You can see it doesn't go all the way to the center. And this is a goofy thing about cylinders and why we made that cap at the very beginning. Because it wouldn't make these edge loops later if we didn't. But, that's just some quirky modeling stuff. And I'm trying to help you avoid that in the future. So one thing we can do here is scale this out just a little bit. And, we just did those two. So now it's not a flat surface all the way to the end. But, again, that's no big deal. We do things and then we change it back, and it's very adaptable, and you need to be the same in your knowledge and application of everything that you know for modeling. So you can kind of do whatever you need to do, and you're not kind of constrained by the tools or the decisions you make. You can just kind of go with the flow. So now we have the general shape of this thing. The big question is, how do we make the kind of a ribbed looking kind of cylinders here all the way around? And so we'll address that first. Let's deal with this. It looks like it's kind of a beveled edge here. It's kind of rounded. So let's bevel the edge first. So I'll double click this and I'll double click that. And let's look at the point is probably beveled too here. So let's go to bevel and let's go to the input here for bevel and drag out a few more segments and then change the fraction a little bit. It looks like it's snapping around, so I'll just click the kind of pie chart here to go to a slower fraction. And I'm not entirely sure why it's freaking out, so I just clicked here and now I'm middle mouse dragging in the viewport. So again, you just kind of have to adapt with however, if it starts acting goofy, you can just route around that problem and not have to worry about it. Cool. So now we have that done. The only thing I would comment on is possibly, using higher subdivisions at the beginning, because now you can see there it's kind of faceted here. It's not totally round all the way around. One trick you can try is hitting 3 on your keyboard, and that will smooth the model. In general, in hard surface modeling, you'll probably do that at the very end, but you want to make sure all of your geometry is kind of accurate and stuff. In this kind of series of lessons about the Ghostbuster trap, I'm trying to model things in a way that we don't have to rely on that, and that we can be a little more sloppy with our geometry. But in this case, it works pretty well. So we can leave it in 3 mode, and that kind of solve the problem of this not being rounded enough. And I can, go between 1 and 3 to show you the difference. And if you hit 2, that's just kind of an intermediate. It tries to show you the one you had before, but because they're right on top of each other, it's really hard to see. So mainly you're just going to use 1 and 3 to see the difference between smoothing something and not smoothing something. So we have that. Let's go back to 1 just because that's how we're going to model things. Let's add a edge loop right in the center of this thing that goes all the way around. And that's what we're going to tell these ribs to follow. So we need one right in the middle here. Let's go to the edge loop tool. We'll go back to the tool settings and just crank this down to 1. And that way it'll just put 1 right in the dead center of, well, 1 right in the dead center. You can see I accidentally clicked a few things, and so I just hit undo, go back to object mode, and we're golden. And I'll get off the edge loop tool so I don't accidentally make more edge loops again. All right, so now we have this edge loop. Let's go to the edge mode by right clicking and dragging up. Select that edge, double click it, and let's go to modify, convert, polygon edges to curve. And we'll click the little box on the end there to get the options. And I want to choose linear because I want it to follow exactly where the edge loop is. I don't want it to interpolate and get curvy. And so we're going to choose linear for right now and convert. Now you can see we have a curve here that follows exactly the shape. So now with that, we have something to add the ribs to. There's a couple different ways we could have gone about doing this. This is one way. Another way is using Mesh, which we will talk about later, which is used for motion graphics. And you can use Mesh to help you model some things as well, especially things that are patterns. But this is kind of a tried and true method, and you don't have to rely on some new plugin thing that Maya has come out in the last couple of years. It can have its own problems. So it's good to just know how to do things, with the bare bones Maya tools, and also get introduced to some new things. And this is also, we're going to hack kind of an animation tool to use for this. So I'm going to go to poly modeling. I'm going to make the one rib. So I'm going to scale it down. I'm just going to pull it over here so I can see it, and scale this all the way down, make this a little bigger, drag it over here so I can kind of see the size and see, it almost goes all the way to the edge. So let's just scale it up to about there. And then it looks like these are pretty rounded at the top. So let's just go to edge mode, and I'm just going to select everything. And you can see actually, if you shift select things, it will deselect things you have selected. If you want to add to a selection and you're clicking and dragging over something that is already selected, it's going to deselect it. If you don't want that to happen, okay, if you do not want that to happen, you have to hit Control and Shift. And now it'll add to that selection, even if you go over an area that you've already selected. But what we want to do is Control click and deselect that, because we just want to bevel the tops here. And I'll go from a top-down view, hitting spacebar, clicking and dragging over to top view, hit F to frame up, and Control click the center piece here. So it'll deselect everything, go back to perspective mode by hitting spacebar, and let's go to the bevel tool, and let's increase that fraction and bump up the segments. Yeah, so we'll just happen to have it on the slow mode here, so I change that to, now I can middle mouse drag in the viewport with that selected, and it will go a lot quicker. So let's, get into something like that. In general, you want to try not to add a ton of geometry if you don't need it. And this is such a small piece. I'm trying to keep it as light as possible. Okay, so now we have that piece, and it's going to sit in like this. But the big question is, how do we get this piece to go all the way around this object? We could click and drag and try to place, duplicate one and try to place it exactly, but that's super tedious. And we want to try to use the tools to our advantage. So let's go to the animation window here. We've been modeling. Now let's go to animation. And let's click the poly to curve tool, and let's shift click the cylinder. Let's go to constrain, and we'll go down to motion paths. And I'm just going to tear this off. Attach to motion path. So what we have now, if we click and drag the timeline, even though we're still in the modeling course, don't get confused. Even though we're using the timeline and we are in animation now, we're using this to help us model. So what we've created is that this follows the path. If I select these two things and I isolate it here, you can see this, and you can see it says 120 here. And that means, it's going over the timeline that we had. If this was further out, it would have gone to 194 or whatever. But because it was at 120, that's the length of the timeline. So that's what it's doing. It's going to animate over the length of that. Okay. So we have this. Now, the thing we want to do is, if you notice, if you hit play over here, it starts slow, it speeds up, and it slows in. Slow, speed up, slow in. Okay, we don't want that. We want it to be linear because we're going to use this. We're hacking this. We want it to have even intervals around this piece. And we're going to duplicate this thing around. And if it starts slow here and we're trying to go at even intervals, there'll be a lot more of these at the beginning, and they'll be further spaced out here. So we want this to go at the same speed all the way around. And the way we do that, and again, this is kind of animation stuff, but when you learn 3D, you need to know a little bit of everything to create things. So you can see we have this motion path here. We have the curve selected. Now we have an output for the motion path. If we click that, we can see this little red dot. And that means there's a keyframe. And now that we toggled this down, we also have these red dots on the timeline that weren't there before. So there's a couple different ways we can change the handles of this so it'll be the same length, the same speed through the whole length of this timeline. But we could do it here in the timeline, but I want you to see it visually since it's the first time you're introduced to this stuff. We'll go to Windows, Animation, and we'll go to the Graph Editor. This will open up a new window, and now we see a motion path 1 U curve, and that's what we were looking at over here, motion path 1 U value. And you can see it starts slow, speeds up, and ends slow. So I'm clicking and dragging the kind of vertex here, the keyframe, and I'm selecting this one, and I want to go and hit this straight line here, and it's going to straighten that out. So now we can close this. We'll learn all about animation and Graph Editor more later, but for right now, that's all we need to know. So if we play this back, now it's going to go the same speed all the way around. When this loops, you won't be able to tell the difference with the speed. See, now it just goes all the way around, and there's no speed changes, and that's exactly what we want. Perfect. Okay, so if we go back to the Animate tab here, we're under Animation, and we go Visualize, Create Animation Snapshot. I'm going to open up the option box here, and what we want to do is go the entire length of this thing. So we'll add 120 because that's the timeline over here. We're at 120. We'll go start to end. We could also we could say time slider, which will kind of automatically do that, so it grays these out. But either one, it's the same thing if you change this number. So we'll say, increment will be 1, and then let's say increment 2. Well, whatever. Let's just leave it at default. We'll say reset settings and make sure we're all at the default. So with this selected, we actually want to select the cylinder, not the curve, and let's hit apply. So when we unisolate this, now when we can see what we've actually made. So it made way too many of these things. So let's go and unisolate this. And with the cylinder selected, let's say an increment of 2 now instead. We'll hit apply. I'll take a second, and now you can see these ribs. And that looks a lot closer to what we need and what is showing up here. So the only thing that I would say is that maybe these need to be closer into the object, like they're poking out too far. So one way we can do that, let's hit undo. We'll go to the curve and let's isolate it. And I'll right click and say Control Vertex, click and drag these. So let's hold down D and X and middle mouse snap it to the center. So now when I scale this down, everything should scale from the center, okay? So now when we do the snapshot, we go to Visualize and create animation snapshot. We have 2.2 on, and again, this value could be different for you. This is just based on the size of the thing that I made, so this will probably be different for you. I'm just taking a guess at, what will be the right distribution for mine. So to kind of lock in these changes, now you can see it's all the way around correctly. To lock in these changes, we need to delete the history. So let's go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, and let's select all of these, Shift Select, hit G, and we'll middle mouse drag them out. And I just let go down here anywhere. And let's delete that snapshot group. So now we have the ribs, and we have the cylinder. We can delete the original one. We can also delete the curve because we don't really need all that stuff now. So now we could even just middle mouse drag and put this under the cylinder. Okay, and we can also see there's maybe an extra one here, so we can just delete that. So now we have our knob, and we need to place it in the right spot. Let's unhide the trap, hitting Shift H. Let's select the cylinder, drag it out here, and let's rotate it down. We can see it should be 90 degrees, negative 90 degrees in X. And we can also just scale the whole thing down, and you can see because we parented the ribs under the cylinder, it's following along with whatever we're doing. And this is called a parent and child relationship. And we did the same thing with the group earlier, that everything is a child of this group node. So if we move the group node, everything will move because everything underneath it is a child. And you can do that by middle mouse dragging things in the outliner. You can also do it by selecting 2 things and then hitting P on your keyboard for a shortcut. So there's different ways to do it, but let's just get this kind of in the right spot. Maybe drag it up. It looks like it's tilted to the side a little bit, and it has this black disk here. So I'm actually just going to steal one of these disks here, Command D to duplicate it. And also talking about parenting, you can hit Shift P to unparent something. So you can see it pop this out from that group. And we can just scale this up. And let's just bring it over here to the center of this thing. And now we can click the cylinder, make sure we just have the cylinder selected, and rotate it so it's kind of at an interesting angle instead of straight down. And now for later, we have this disk that we'll be able to color something differently. Let's see if it goes, yeah, almost all the way. So let's just do something like that. I just kind of eyeballed it. It's in the center, close enough. You could vertex snap it, do all that stuff if you want. But that is looking pretty good. In the next lesson, we will create this top structure really quickly. And you can do the same knob thing here. You can just duplicate this one out, add those, and but the next thing we'll do is just finish up this model and complete the top, and we'll move on to a character in the next series of lessons about 3D modeling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome to this lesson. In this next section, we're going to kind of speed model this kind of top section where the doors will open and this front element here. So I'm going to model this as quickly as possible and just kind of talk you through what I'm doing. First off, I'm going to make a cube, bring this up, and think about extruding this along kind of the center here, just to make that kind of first element where the doors will open from. And if we look here, there's a ridge there maybe. For now, I just want to do this flat thing and I'll deal with the doors later. I want to get this solid piece that goes all the way down here and they can come out, that kind of a thing. So I'm looking at where this meets the other spot, the proportion of how big it is relative to everything else. So these vertices, right-clicking and going to vertex, should snap, holding down V, to the edge here, and same thing with these over here. So I'm holding down V, and I have the transform, so I'm going to go to object mode, get back into that, and drag this down. Look at the reference, that actually goes all the way up to the edge of the handle, it looks like. So we can snap these as well. Hold down V, and whoop, and drag over. See if we can get it. There we go. Same thing with the spots here. We want it to hit the floor or the kind of top of this thing. So I'm actually going to hold down spacebar, click, and go to right view, or yeah, right view is fine. And then drag this up. It doesn't have to be exact. We could actually even just crash this all the way through if we wanted, which is what I'll probably just do for speed at the moment. The only thing we need to worry about though is that if we're going to extrude this piece out from here, it does need to match the top, it looks like, because it's going to come out of the top. So let's get that aligned, hold spacebar, go to right view, and get that there. The reason I'm not using V is because it's not registering which vertice to snap to. So in that instance, I just come in really close, zoom in with my camera super close, and I have the manipulator tool selected for Y, so I know that I can zoom in, for example, let's say on these vertices, and I don't have the manipulator tool, but what I can do is hold down the middle mouse button and drag, and I know it's locked to that vertical axis, so that's another way to do it. And I can zoom in super close and get and even hit wireframe by hitting 4. And there we go. Oh my gosh. Okay, there we go. Okay, hold down spacebar, click, go to perspective view, hit 5, and then we can extrude this out, but first we need an edge. So I need to go to my custom shelf, hit an edge in here, and we have the tools set so it does multiple loops. So I'm just going to turn that off. Go to the relative distance and just kind of drag this somewhere in here and double click it, go back to the reference. It looks like it's pretty close to the edge. So I'm going to drag this all the way here. And what I'm looking at is this is going to be extruded outward. I don't know if you can see my mouse that well, but this needs to be pretty far to the edge. Might have to move all of this as well. So drag this out. Let's just drag. Doesn't really matter. Let's drag it here and then go to face. I'm going to select both sides and extrude this out. I'll turn off the tool window here so we get more screen real estate. And I'm just going to drag this out, and I think it goes, oh no, it's on just on the inside. So we'll go here, and we'll select these faces, and we'll extrude it out just past the edge here. So we'll extrude again, just past the edge, and then it looks like we'll extrude again and then scale it down. So let's hit G, because we can just extrude again, and then I'm going to hit R to go to scale this down to get that edge there. It looks a little more blocky than what I have. So I'm going to bring it out a little more. Maybe scale it back. That looks closer. Then we have the flat edge, and then this one comes out. There's a little corner here. So that one also goes down. So we can make an edge loop here, and extrude out that face from this corner and this corner. So we need an edge loop that goes here, and we need an edge loop that goes down this area, kind of that would cross this axis there and there. And we might actually be pretty close with these. Let's see. That distance I'm looking at, it might be actually, this one is pretty darn close. The only problem is when we scaled in, these scaled in with it, so we can scale these back out. And it looks like we might have a situation where we, oh, the faces weren't kept together, that's why. So let's undo this. And this is an important part of extruding and keeping the faces together when you need it. So let's go back to extrude, and keep faces together is off. And I just wanted to take a second to show you where to change the defaults for the issue that I'm having with setting the keep faces together on. If we go down to modeling, we can say keep faces together, and that's going to be the default now. I'll hit save, and that's that. So when I hit extrude, I'm going to turn on keep faces on now. So now it will behave correctly. And because I know we're going to want to extrude this next one by hitting G, instead of scaling in on all the faces so that these edge loops stay straight, I'm just going to grab these two edges and scale them in, because I want to keep those inward edges straight, because what we're going to do now is add an edge loop here. And if those were crooked, it would follow it here, right? And we don't want that. So to get an even edge loop on both sides, I'm going to go back into the tool and turn on multiple edge loops and crank this up. And there we go. And then just double click all of these. Actually, we want that's the one we want to keep. So I'm just shift double clicking all of these really quickly. And it may seem tedious, but it's a surefire way to know that they're evenly spaced. So I'll leave that last one, shift right click, drag, delete edge. And now we have that kind of buffer that we can extrude this other piece from. So I'm going to select these, and you can actually see where I made room for here in between the last lessons, and I added this plate, and we can move that later to match this width. So I'm going to hit extrude again and make sure keep faces together is on. And because they're all going in kind of different directions, I'm going to use the slider here and just crank up the thickness. And now we can kind of play. Let's look at this. This is a flat edge, so it's more of a triangle. And same down there. So there's a couple of different ways we can go about resolving that triangle. Let's do a little multi-cut. I think this is the right amount of distance. That's what this kind of piece here could be pushed back a little bit, it looks like here. I don't really care about this face being a weird angle now because I'm going to delete it in a second anyways. I'm just looking at this gap here, making sure it's the right distance. All these little things add up, right? You know, again, we're just kind of approximating this, but those little details are kind of nice to hit. So I'm going to delete these faces here in a second, but what I'm going to do first is use the multi-cut tool and just draw a line between those two areas and create a new little triangle here. And you'll see why in a second, because we're going to delete all the faces up top. So I'm going to go to the face mode by right-clicking, dragging to face, go to Q or W. I'm going to turn this off, and shift-click these faces and delete them. We can also take those away, delete those, and it looks like I snagged a straight face here. And that's one thing I just kind of do by habit. I like spin around as soon as I delete faces because I want to make sure I didn't do something like that. And if you're using 4, you could also toggle in 4 real quick, and you'll see that kind of red area pop up as a selection. So then we're going to use the append polygon tool, click an edge in here, and now you can see the arrows working a little better and which direction we need to click the edges. And once we get that flat plane, now we can hit enter. So we do have this kind of weird normal issue that we have dealt with before. We can address that later with the mesh display options that we showed in a previous lesson. But let's just keep finishing up the model here. I'm going to adjust these by going to the vertices and clicking and dragging those. And I almost want to scale those out. I think because it's going to be such a small amount, it won't matter, but scaling bevels, like I mentioned earlier, is always a little dangerous because the bevel is going to change. But because I'm scaling it by such a small amount, and it's on the inside of something, like you would never really see that anyways. So let's go back here, and we're seeing that this is below here, and this goes in at an angle. So I think this is more supposed to be up here, but still below this area. And we can just select these and drag those in and down, because we're just going to crash that right into the other model just for speed's sake. You don't necessarily have to attach these things, and this needs to go way closer to the edge. I'm going to Control Shift dragging, because again, if I were to shift select that, it'll deselect it. So again, shift drag, it won't select everything. You have to Control Shift select, Control Shift drag to select that stuff. So shift select this, drag it in. The one issue you can see here remaining is the fact that because we didn't click that last edge here, it didn't line up with this vertice, and that's something we can fix pretty easily and quick here in a second. So I'm going to get the multi-cut tool and go based off of this vertice. I'm just going to click this over here somewhere. Whoop, it's going through the model. Look away from it so there's nothing behind it. And enter. And then I'm going to select that and vertex snap it by holding V and middle mouse dragging over to that vertice. And now we've got it. And here's a new thing that we're going to learn, is how to merge vertices. So I'm going to shift, I'm just going to click and drag select. So I know I have both of those vertices selected. I'm going to go to Edit Mesh, Merge. And there's kind of a threshold distance, so depending on the scale that you're at, it may or may not work, but you can hit apply, and then you can see that the normals kind of change. They flash there for a second, so that makes me think that it worked. But you can always test it by dragging an edge or something around. And it thinks I have something clicked when I don't. It's always fun. So to make sure this gets in line, we can just drag this up for now. Let's see. Is there a... No, it's a straight line. So we could eyeball this, or we could just delete this and redo the append to polygon thing so that we know it's a straight line. But I'm not too worried about it. It's pretty straight based on, you know, my eye at least. It's pretty darn close. Okay, now we have this kind of interior face set up. We can extrude that out, or we could model it on its own. It really depends on whatever you want to do. But the other thing I want to go ahead and do is just bevel all of these edges. So I'm going to go ahead and also make this thing before I do that. So I'm going to select this face, I'm going to extrude, and then I'm going to scale in slightly in this direction, and in that direction maybe. And I'm going to hit G again, and it doesn't matter if keep faces together on, because it's just a single face. I'm just going to smash that through. And We could also make it a deeper hole if we wanted to by doing the same thing here. So let's isolate select this piece. I'm going to go to the object mode, select that piece, and go to isolate select. And we can see we have a lot of faces here that we would need to extrude down. So that's something you can do as well to make that a deeper hole. But I think so I'm going to undo isolate select, and we can pick this up in the next lesson where we will bevel these edges, create the doors, maybe clean this up so we don't have this issue, and in a later lesson we're going to make a cord for this thing. And yeah, so we're moving right along. Thanks for watching. Welcome to this lesson where we will finish up this front element and the doors. And I want to talk about this issue. It basically has a weird visibility issue just because there's one face right on top of the other. As soon as you click one or the other, it'll show the one you've clicked. But that's why when you don't have either clicked and you look around, it's kind of a weird view. Let's deal with that. We can isolate select this thing, like I was mentioning earlier, and go to the face and select these, Control Shift select those little corners here, which are probably going to be proved to be an issue. We can deal with those in a second. Control Shift select anything that we don't need, hit 4 to make sure we only have that top selection selected, and go to extrude and keep faces together. And let's just pull this down and see what we get so far. We go back to shaded mode so we can see. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to undo that and maybe just scale these in a little bit so they're not right at the edge, and then redo that and make sure keep faces together is on, and now drag it in. So now that we have this a little bit of a border there. Let me make sure I didn't undo not far enough back, it looks like. Oh, this is the issue because these aren't following along here. So let's just drag it down for time's sake because we have we already have the top area modeled. When we unisolate select that, we can see we're good there. We can just drag this one back up and actually just vertex snap it. So let's go to the front view. Oops. Actually, I lost my selection there, so I'm going to go back to select that, go to the front view, and we can hit we can hit 4 to get the sideways view and just drag that back up to be even. Go back to perspective mode, right click to go to object mode, hit 5, and now we can see we have a deeper hole here, but yeah, let's go to isolate and select that. And the main issue is it's extruding through itself, so we're seeing the back side of the faces. So we can just delete this face, and there we go, and that solved the problem. And we can just drag this one down as far as we want and unisolate select that. We can see this issue here with the internal piece, so we can resolve this, you know, if we want to. It depends on how much you're going to see this stuff. You basically don't want to spend a ton of time modeling things you're never going to see, is a big rule with modeling, because if you work for a studio or something and you spend all your time modeling something no one's ever going to see, your supervisor's not going to be too happy. So it's all about what the viewer's going to see from the camera angle, and if you're working on a show or a movie, they are going to tell you exactly what to model, hopefully. Sometimes that changes and you have to adapt to that. But so now we have this front element, and let's kind of call this good. Maybe pull this edge back a little bit, is slightly annoying. I just shift select that, hit 4 to make sure I have nothing else selected. Just drag that back a little bit, hit 5. Cool, we don't see that. Go to object mode. And so now I want to take this element and let's see what we get if we just bevel this whole thing. I think we're going to have to select edges, but just for time's sake, yeah. I mean, it's pretty close. We're adding a lot of geometry to this thing unnecessarily. So I'm going to go back out and get a little more specific with the exact edges I'd like to bevel. If we look at the reference, it's kind of all of these outside angles are beveled. So I'm just going to grab those. And of course the top edges here. And let's see, we could do the bottom edges as well. And I'm choosing not to merge these. You could spend more time on this and merge these so they're not separate pieces. But for time's sake, trying to keep this tutorial shorter and not keep going on and on, I'm just choosing to do what I think is fastest for us, and you're still learning a little bit. So cool, now we're almost have all of our selections made. We just need to go down this edge, this edge, this edge, this edge, and this one, this one. Accidentally selected that one. And that one. I'll grab that. Cool. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and grab that one. I'm going to go ahead and do those. I think, you know, it should be flush with it, but it's a much more pain in the butt to try to bevel things after the fact, because the number of lines, like where they meet, won't line up, and it just creates a lot more work. So I'm just going through, tumbling around this thing, making sure we have all of the angles. I'm going to maybe grab this one too. All the angles covered here. Now let's bevel this. So let's go to the poly bevel. We can also hit T to pull up the options here. And let's just add one segment and call that good. And you can see the issue when we beveled this. Of course, now it's not flush. We can resolve that in a couple different ways. We can just pull out this edge. And because it's on both sides, probably going to scale it. That's a little bit of a sloppy way to do it, but you know, it gets the job done for speed's sake instead of having to merge this stuff. What you could do is go in and add a lot of extra edge loops here. So we could add one here, and then we could delete faces and then merge vertices where these points meet. That's how I would merge all of those together. But then, you know, since we beveled these, now we have a lot of edge loops to do. And I think for our purposes of just learning, just beginners, you know, trying to discover what modeling is all about, I don't want us to get in the weeds too much on that stuff. So we have a nicely beveled piece here, and we can just maybe extrude these two faces for this front plate element. So I'll go to extrude, keep faces on, and sorry, I want the offset to try to bring it in just a little bit. And then let's hit G again and keep faces on. Just drag this out a little bit. It looks like that should be way closer to the edges. So I think we went too far on the offset. Let's go offset, like point. You know, we can click this thing here. And now when we middle mouse drag, it'll be a lot smaller. So that's probably the best option for us. So then we can hit G again. So now that we've created this little separation of these faces, we can go back and extrude this out and see how far out it comes. Not super far. It seems like a really beveled edge though, like super smooth, more than what we just did. So let's do that. Bevel, hit T, or sorry, we need to go to bevel edge first, and now we have it, and we're going to increase the segments here. Now I need to speed this back up because it wasn't really working that well because it was going so slow. So now we have this element modeled. I think what I'd like to see though, hit T again, I think that fractions maybe is too much, or we need more segments. It was kind of too faceted. You could see the edges a little too much. Cool. So that's done. And we can extrude this center face, and it looks like it kind of slopes into it maybe from the top. I don't know. It depends on how you view this image or what the reference you find and use. But I'm just gonna do the same thing we just did. Extrude, keep faces on. Dial this down so we can get a little more specific on the offset. Middle mouse drag here in the center to get the offset. In the ballpark, it's pretty small. It looks like it's kind of thinner. So I'm going to scale it in this direction. But that it's still in the center, I need to drag it up a little bit. So I'm going to pull this out just a touch because that looks like what's happening in the reference. So it makes our bevel a little wonky because it's trying to get flat at the top here. And we can just delete those top edges so that it's more gradual. So I might do that. Go to Edge, select these, double click it. It should go all the way around. It does. Right click, go to Delete Edge. So now it's more of a gradual. If you look at this profile, it's going in there a little better. So now we have this plate. Extrude this again. So let's go to Extrude. Pull this out. Extrude, hit G. Oh, we need to keep faces together though. Extrude that again by hitting G. Keep faces together. Increase the offset here. It looks like, right? Yeah. Let's maybe go back here. Hit G again, extrude again, keep faces together. Just smash that down into this thing. I don't know how far, it's hard to see from this angle how far that thing goes down. Just go somewhere like that. And then we can just bevel these edges and kind of call it a day on this stuff. And in the next lesson, I want to show you a very interesting way to model a chord, something that kind of has like an organic shape to it. And even though we're doing hard surface stuff, a lot of hard surface things like mech type things have chords associated with them. So we want to make sure that we know how to do that if you're interested in the hard surface kind of arena. So I'm just going to increase the segments there, go to object mode so I can kind of see it in shaded. And it looks like we just have like a normals issue here. It doesn't know which way to pull. The other thing we can do is add some more geometry here with the multi-cut tool, and hopefully that will alleviate some of the normals problems. Because as I mentioned earlier, Maya doesn't really like triangles, and we just created a couple there. But if we put that down, we're going to make another one. So I might just leave that as it is. Just do these two. Cool. So I think, you know, if we go back through and do what we did in a previous lesson to resolve the normals issues with mesh display, we can just do that super quick. Set to face. So that actually looks pretty good just by going with the averaging the faces. If you wanted to get more specific with that, you can do that. But it's really just for our purposes in Viewport. When you create renders of this, those normal faces won't matter as much. But we got this done, and I'm going to quickly create the doors super quick. So I'm going to drag this up, and I'm going to vertex snap this to one side, and then vertex snap this to the edge. And I held D and V to change the pivot, of course, and then I held V just to transform it to the side here, so that it will all scale from this point. And again, I can use the vertex snapping here, or I can just kind of eyeball it, because anything mechanical is going to have a gap there, so it can not exactly rub up against things. The one thing we want to make sure is that these in the center are in fact in the center. So let's go to the right view and hit 4. And now we can see the center line. If we hold down X, we can snap to the grid. So now we know that's right in the center. And we can actually just pull that back just a touch. So again, there's a little bit of a gap there. And let's right click object mode and hit 5 to go back into shaded. Scale this down so the door is more of a door size. and bring it up to the top of this edge here. So that looks pretty good. The last thing we need to do is, of course, bevel this thing just a touch. So I'm actually just going to leave it on object mode and go to our custom shelf, click bevel. And I'm going to go pretty small on the bevel and bring back the fraction. So it's just barely beveled, just so it's not a very hard edge there. And then what I'm going to do is duplicate this by hitting Command D. And what I can do, there's a couple different ways you can do this. You could scale it negative in this direction. So we go -1. So it flips it around, and then we can hold down V and snap it to this other side. So it should, I think we're snapping to the wrong thing. It's snapping to the bevel, one of the bevels instead of the edge there. So let's go to the right view, hit 4, and just snap that to the inside. So now we can see in the center here, they're equally far apart from the middle. We might need to adjust that a touch. Let's look at this. Yeah, let's just bring those in just a little bit. So we can click both of those and hit R, and then just scale from here. Since it's just a small amount, it's not going to really hurt the bevels that we did. Just kind of close that gap just a touch. Cool. So now we have our Ghostbusters trap, pretty much. We can add these little rivets that we put up here if we'd like. We can add this back element. You basically at this point have all the knowledge you need to model this back area. And then in the last lesson here, it's going to be very short. We're just going to make this a cord that can come off of the back of this thing. So I will show you how to do that in the next lesson. Thanks for watching. Welcome to the last lesson in the series of creating this Ghostbuster trap. In between the previous lesson and this one, I just made this little back end piece here. And I just basically did that with all the techniques we've already learned. I extruded the top of it to make this little kind of a rim, and then I beveled all of the edges. And I also added this little kind of a wing here. So I added edge loops here, and then I beveled those kind of corners there. And then finally I made this little piece that sticks out the back, and this is basically a cylinder that I reduced the number of subdivision axes down to 8 to make it more like a some kind of nut that you would have to screw in there. And then this is just another cylinder that I extruded out and then beveled all the edges to make this kind of port for the cord we're going to make in this lesson. So that's just an update on, some updates I did that, you've learned all these techniques already. Same thing for finishing out this other side based on the reference. You've easily already learned how to do this little panel. So I'll leave that up to you to finish out this other side with all the techniques we've already learned. I also added a little thing here that I've seen in some reference. It's just a cylinder, beveled edges, same kind of thing. So let's learn how to do this cord. Let's first revisit the idea of curves we did in the previous lesson. And that's going to be basically the template for how we're going to extrude a cylinder over this curve. So let's go to a top-down view so we can see kind of where this is going to come out. I'm going to hit 4 to see through this thing, so now I can see where it's going to meet down there. I'm going to go to the Curves and Surfaces kind of tab here. You could also go to Create and go to Curve Tools, and you can get the same kind of a tools here. So you can see the similarities there. I'm going to go to the EP Curve tool, and I'm going to open up the tool settings so that I can see that we're on 3 cubic. So it's going to start to interpolate kind of a rounded edge there after I go 3 points. So I'm going to hit X to line up on the grid, and then I'm just going to kind of make a swooping kind of a curve chord path here. And this is just going to kind of trail off in the distance. You can make it be whatever you'd like it to be, but and of course I'm going to hit enter, and then you can always edit this later by right clicking, go to Control Vertex, and then drag these around if you want to change the kind of curves that you've made. And we're going to need to do that at the insert point here because it's not matching where it's going to be inserting. So I'm going to go up here and lift all of these and then bring this one in and have this kind of secondary one, make sure that it's going in straight. You can also rebuild the curve if you didn't make enough points. You can see how it starts to kind of get a little jagged here. It's not like super smooth. So you can go to, with the curve selected, you can go to curves, and then down at the bottom there's rebuild. You can go to the options and uniform. You can set the number of spans, all these different types of options, but this is kind of the most common. Just hit apply. You can see how it curved out this thing here. I'm going to undo it and then redo it, and so you can see it a little better. I'll zoom in here. So I'm going to redo it, and you can see how that kind of curves and finishes it out. But the only issue is now when we go back into control vertice, there's a lot more vertices to control. So it's good to kind of get this working before you add a ton of vertices that then you have to control. If that's the case and you have a ton of vertices, you can hit B on your keyboard, and that turns on soft selection. You can hold B and middle mouse drag in the viewport to increase or decrease that soft selection area. So that can be helpful if you have a ton of points to drag around. So I'm just going to do something like that, and we can adjust this later as well, but you roughly want to get this in the center of the thing, and you know, want to have a shape that respects gravity and the weight of the cord and all that kind of good stuff. So we may need to get this on the ground sooner, kind of a thing. But yeah, you can mess with all that after the fact as well. But let's get to the meat of this thing, where we need to extrude an actual curve over this thing, or sorry, extrude a cylinder over this thing. So I'm going to turn that off, close that down. And so now we need to create a poly model. I'm going to grab a cylinder, and I'm going to, I know I have it selected because I just created it, but also because I can see it in the outliner, so I don't have to, like, you know, visually see it over there to know that it's selected. So I'm going to hold down C, which snaps to curves, and middle mouse drag that there. Then I'm going to rotate this down and maybe scale it down a little bit and roughly get it in line with this thing. There's a couple different ways you can extrude curves. You could grab a circular curve and do this as well, but then you would have to convert the NURB circle to a polygon, which is under modify, convert NURBs to polygons. But let's just do it with a polygon first so you can see how that is done. I'm going to select the faces of the polygon. I'm going to hit B to turn off soft selection. Control, click, and deselect the ones I don't need. I'm going to shift select the curve. Okay. And then I'm going to go to extrude. Let's hit extrude. And you can see something happened, but not exactly what we wanted. It looks like there's a face now at the very beginning of this curve here in the center. I'm going to turn on keep faces on as well so we can see it. So if I hit 5, you can see it kind of goes inside. That's because curves also have directions. I'm going to go back into object mode so I can select the curve. And we need to reverse the direction. So if I go to curves, reverse direction, now you can see the end of the curve is considered down here. So when you extrude it, it's going to go in that direction. The problem is it's not really respecting the curve that we drew. So we need to go into the extrusion options here. I'll hit T, and we need to increase the divisions. And as we increase the divisions, let me just turn this pie wheel back to a normal speed. As we increase these divisions, you can see that it's actually beginning to make the chord. And that's just because it needed more information, right? So this slider will max out at 25, but you can type in a higher value. We can, there's actually a taper value here as well that you can mess with, and a couple other things. So basically that's how you make a chord. And the things to keep in mind is these subdivisions are based off the distribution of the CVs in the curve. So if we hadn't have rebuild the curve, the distribution here would have been not as accurate. You can see here there are less there are less points here. There's less edges here because there's less points in the curve. If I go to, let me isolate it so I can right click on it, go control vertex. You can see that there's a big gap here between these two. So that's the same, it'll be reflected in the edges of the cylinder. There's less here than there are over here. So just keep that in mind. If we drag this over, it'll kind of group them, you know, and that's, you can still edit this stuff after the fact. Until you delete the history, you can edit this stuff. So the other thing we need to do, we can see if we can go into the polycylinder and change the original radius, and we can, which is a super nice thing about keeping the history, is even though this was, we've done a lot of things to it since we created the cylinder, this first piece of history takes precedence, right? So we can still have that. I'm just gonna hit 5 so we can see this in shaded mode. And the only other thing I might do is rebuild the curve again so that we get a little more definition here in the chord. So you can go to curves, rebuild, and let's just crank this up and hit apply. And then we will probably need to increase the extrusion, the subdivisions, and it totally spazzes out and it turns black because so this original one, sometimes this happens. So you want to keep in mind that you can't do more subdivisions than, you know, are kind of allowed here from the beginning. If we go, I middle mouse drag, so it goes back to the max default you can get by middle mouse dragging. But if we keep increasing this, and this edge here goes past this one, it'll flip the edge around itself. So then it flips all the faces inside out. So if you get this black thing, you've created too many divisions. So let's just go right before that happens. And now we have this kind of smoother looking curve. And then we can also, again, go to the curve and push some points around if we still want to adjust where the kind of density of the edge loops are getting concentrated. Cool. So that's how you extrude an object, make a chord, something like that. Most mech and hard surface models have chords of some sort. And let's just, right before we sign off here, let's just make sure we get the polycylinder radius correct. Something in this neighborhood is a little closer. 0.5. Cool. And then I'll shift select the curve, isolate it, go to the control vertex, select the end one, hit B, maybe drag this out a little bit, and unisolate that, and then just get that right in the center there. So there you have it. We have created the Ghostbuster trap, and we've done it with hard surface modeling techniques. In the next series of lessons, we're going to cover more organic modeling techniques, and we're going to create a character that we will eventually use to rig and animate in later lessons. We're also going to revisit this model later on and texture it and maybe do some animating on this as well. Let's see what we have in store for that later. But great job in following these lessons. If you've gotten this far, that's quite an accomplishment, and it's a lot to take in. So just take your time and rewatch these if you have any problems. And you know, you can always pick up wherever. I'm just middle mouse dragging all this stuff into the top group so it's all organized. Just know you can come back and rewatch this stuff and ask me any questions that you may run into, because yeah, this stuff's not easy, and I admire you guys trying to learn this stuff. So I appreciate you watching, and good luck. Thank you. See you in the next series.
Hi, and welcome to this updated lesson with Maya 2022 coming out just today. I wanted to go ahead and make an updated video that shows you an even better way to make cords, ropes, wires, all that kind of good stuff. They actually came out with a new method, which I want to share with you. So we're going to use the Ghostbuster example and replace the cord that we've previously made in the course. So I'm just going to select that geometry. And before I do delete it, I just wanted to mention notice the issue we had here previously using the extrusion method along a curve. You always had the problem of that extra little bit that you extruded from, and then also the possibility of flipping normals of the faces if you adjusted the curve later. And that seems to be pretty much resolved with this new method. So let's select that geometry and delete it if you're following along with the course project files. And I'm going to select the curve, and kind of weirdly enough, this new feature is not in the mesh controls, it's actually under create. So if you go to create, you have sweep mesh. I'd be curious to see if they leave this function, this operation here, because it seems a bit out of place to have on the create menu. I feel like it's a mesh operation, but anyway, go to create sweep mesh and boom, you have your chord. No fussy extruding along a curve and creating divisions. It's pretty smartly creates the geometry for us. And we have all these settings now in the attribute editor for this sweep mesh creator. So let's run through a few of these. Obviously, first we can see that it's too big. So we can go to the scale profile, and the default profile that we have is a poly profile. And so we can just scale that profile down until we have the correct size for the chord that we want. So it's not intersecting the ground anymore, roughly in here somewhere. And then we can see if we turn on the wireframe on shaded, that it's a bit rough, not just in the profile, but also in along the length. So let's address both of those issues with the resolution of the curve or the mesh that the curve is making. So we can get to the Sweep Mesh Creator tab here, and then we can increase the sides of the circle so that that is solving the profile issue, the resolution there. And then if we scroll down to the Interpolation tab here, we have Mode Precision on, and we can just increase that until we have enough subdivisions along our curve that it's no longer kind of low poly looking. So that's the main kind of points here. And to really get back to the one we had before, we can just click add caps and we're kind of done. So that's really a much more efficient way, I think, to create a curve or a rope than the extrusion method that we've learned previously. Let's take this a little bit further though, because there are some really cool options here to go even further than just a simple chord here. Let's say we wanted a braided rope, or we wanted to create the interior wires of a chord. We could click the distribute button here, and now we have the option to add the number of instances. Let's imagine this is the interior of a chord, and we wanted, wires splaying out. This would be the way to do that. Or if we wanted a braided rope, we could do that very easily as well. All we have to do to get the braided effect is go down to the transformation options here, and then just increase the twist of this. And of course, we can take that past the soft limiter of 2 and type in a value that we want. Of course, with 90, we can see we've kind of broken the model and it's intersecting itself. So that just gave us a better range to now adjust this down to something that makes sense for the subdivisions we have and the length of the chord that we have here. So this is a really easy way to create a braided rope. I can also turn off the wireframe so you can kind of see that. Now, the other thing we're left with is the fact that now these are kind of separated from one another. We can click on the Sweep Mesh Creator to get back to the menu. We can basically adjust 2 values. One is the scale of the instances, so now that they start to kind of intersect each other and connect with each other. The other issue, though, if you want to kind of compensate for the fact that you've scaled everything up, you'd have to go into the scale profile and then bring that down. So we can do that to maintain the overall profile of these instances at the same kind of scale. So you'd have to kind of tweak these together to make sure that you're overall not scaling everything too much. And so those are the 2 things you'd want to adjust. Obviously, there's these other kind of distribution types that you can experiment with to get different types of effects. The other noteworthy adjustments here you can make is a really cool taper here that I think would be useful for hair, if you're doing some kind of who knows what. But it gives you a lot more control than previously, where you'd have to, I don't even really know how you do this previously. But this is a really cool effect, something, that's kind of small to improve upon, but they really went far with it. Now, the other sweep profiles are pretty self-explanatory. They just give you different modes to adjust the profile that it's using. something even like a rectangle could be turned into a sphere just by adjusting the corner radius, for example. But so, and this is a road. If we turn off distribute, we could see, and turn off the twist, we could see, this could be something just to create a path or a road very easily using the line method here. And then of course we have an arc, which is just like a semicircle, very quickly, easily to do. And then we have a wave, which would be, maybe the gutter of a sidewalk or something. But it's pretty nice that they give you these most common scenarios here just at the top menu. And it's very kind of user-friendly, showing these icons like this. Now, the final one I wanted to touch on was custom, and it was a bit finicky when I'm playing with it. Let me show you, obviously it's going to take a custom curve that we define. If I just draw one out, let's just say something like this, and I go back to the mesh and the Sweep Mesh Creator, I can choose this custom and it will pop up this new window that asks me to select what curve I want to use as the profile. Once that's selected, let me turn back on the wireframe on shaded to show you kind of what I mean. The profile that I drew was the cubic interpolation, so it's smooth. But if you look at the profile that we're getting from this, it's very rough. Let me just close this down so you can see the profile of this thing. You can see it's pretty low poly. And the only way I found that would be improved is it appears that this option is actually controlled by the relative scale of the profile, which is kind of surprising. It wouldn't just take an absolute kind of interpolation of this. So what I mean is, because this is relatively small, I guess, for however it's determining that scale factor, is if we scale this up at the control vertex level, so if I just take these and I scale these up, you can see it starts to add more subdivisions. So now it gets to be a lot smoother. So it's based on the relative scale. Maybe it's the length relative to the length of the curve. It's being swept down. I'm not really sure, but just know if you're not getting the right result for the custom, it's probably because the scale of the control vertices. Again, I'm not scaling this at the object level. I'm scaling this at the control vertex level. You can see if I scale this up at the object level, it's not changing at all. You got to do it and go into actually edit the control vertices and scale those up. So that's kind of one finicky thing I noticed experimenting with this. And then again, obviously the way to counteract this is it scaled up the entire thing. And if we just want to scale that down, we can just scale it down through these attributes here and get back down to the size that we wanted. But that's something noteworthy to look out for if you wanted to use a custom effect. I think this would be great. Like if you're doing, corner trim in a room and you're modeling a room or something, it'd be a great way to get custom trim swept along a curve instead of using the old extrude method. So I'm really excited to use this in my next projects. So hopefully this is helpful for you and you get some cool ideas to use it in your own projects. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Congrats on finishing the course. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to take the entire thing, click the link in the description and we can make this character together from scratch and create this whole animation from modeling, texturing, rigging, animation, and effects. And so that's what you can get from the entire program. Now, if you're interested in learning animation, I have an entire kind of mentored program called Animator's Journey, and that specific deep dive into only animation, right? If you want to work as a professional animator like I do at big studios, that is where I'm teaching everything I know about animation is in Animator's Journey. You can find it at animatorsjourney.com. So I'll see you there, or hopefully in the full course. And thanks for watching the free course. Best of luck in your journey, whichever direction it takes.